The most important witness to the most watched death of the 20th century cannot remember what happened. He has said this himself, in one of the most devastating sentences in the history of the investigation into Diana's death. "I'm the only person who can tell people for real, and I can't remember." His name is Trevor Rees-Jones. He was in the front seat of the Mercedes that entered the Pont de l'Alma tunnel at approximately 96 miles per hour at 12:23 in the morning on the 31st of August 1997. He was there. His last true memory is climbing into the car at the back of the Ritz hotel approximately 3 minutes before the crash. Everything after that, the tunnel, the pillar, the impact, is gone. Every bone in his face was broken. The surgeon who treated him said he had never seen so many fractures on a man who was still alive. His face was reconstructed in a 10-hour operation using 150 titanium parts, working from a photograph taken before the crash, because the face was unrecognizable. His mother Gil said afterward that it had looked like it had been hit by a frying pan in a Tom and Jerry cartoon, smashed back and flattened. He spent 10 days in a coma. When he came out of the coma, he could communicate only by whispering and writing. He had lost his memory of the last hours before the crash. He would eventually have 2 flashbacks. His psychiatrist examined both flashbacks and told him they were false memories. And there was a rumor, widely circulated in the hours after the crash, that he had survived because he was wearing a seatbelt. The 2006 Operation Paget investigation established that none of the 4 occupants of the car were wearing seatbelts. He survived without a seatbelt, without a memory, with a face that had to be rebuilt from a photograph. He was 29 years old. The person who knows what happened in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel on the 31st of August 1997 cannot tell you what happened, not because he won't, because he genuinely does not know. He has received anonymous phone calls from people telling him to keep quiet. "We know who you are, we know where you are, and we know where you live." He was asked at the 2008 inquest about a reported encounter with a woman in which he had said, "If I remember, they're going to kill me." He did not take the calls seriously. He is, in his own words, big enough and ugly enough to look after himself. But the threat presupposes a memory, and the memory is the thing that he does not have. The threat is the threat of the people who believe that the memory exists and is being suppressed. The forensic evidence, the medical evidence, the testimony of the neuroscientists who examined the injury and the amnesia, all of it points in the same direction. The memory is not being suppressed. The memory is not there. Mohamed Al Fayed, whose son Dodi died in the crash, accused Rees-Jones of lying, of faking the amnesia, of being part of a British intelligence conspiracy to cover up the murder of Diana and Dodi. Rees-Jones responded at the 2008 inquest with a sentence that has not received the attention it deserves. "I am not part of any conspiracy to suppress the truth at all. All I have ever done is give the truth as I see it. The truth as he sees it has a hole in the middle of it, the size of 3 minutes. 3 minutes between the back door of the Ritz and the concrete pillar of the Pont de l'Alma. 3 minutes that the most important surviving witness cannot see." This is the account of Trevor Rees-Jones, the man who was there, the man who cannot remember, the man who survived what 3 other people did not, the man who rebuilt his face with titanium, and rebuilt his career, and rebuilt his life, and still wakes up every day without the 3 minutes that the world has been trying to reconstruct ever since. If you are enjoying this story so far, hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. Trevor Rees was born on the 3rd of March 1968 in Rinteln, a garrison town in West Germany, which was the specific geography that the British Army's post-war presence in Germany had organized as the available geography for the families of the British Army's serving members. His father, Colin Rees, was a surgeon in the British Army. His mother, Gil, was a nurse. The family was the family of the professional military couple whose specific domestic geography was organized around the Army's postings rather than the civilian's fixed address. The geography of the person who grows up understanding that the available home is the available home of the posting rather than the permanent home of the settled. He was the middle of 3 brothers. Gareth was the eldest, John was the youngest, Trevor was in between. the middle son of the army surgeon and the nurse, born in a garrison town in West Germany, growing up in the specific formation of the person whose early years are organized around the mobility of the military family rather than the rootedness of the civilian one. When he was 10 years old, the family moved to Oswestry. Oswestry is a market town in Shropshire, close to the Welsh border, close to his father's childhood home, the kind of town whose specific character is the character of the English-Welsh borderland. The town that is neither entirely English nor entirely Welsh, and that has organized its specific identity around the both and the neither in the specific way that the borderland towns do. The family had come home to the borderland from the garrison town in Germany. Trevor was 10. The borderland became the formation. The school was Fitzalan High School in Oswestry. At Fitzalan, Rees enrolled in the Combined Cadet Force. The Combined Cadet Force is the school-based military training organization that the British educational system has maintained in its schools since the 19th century, providing the students who join it with the basic military formation that the formation requires, the drill and the discipline, and the specific quality of the person who has been introduced to the institutional requirements of the military before the military has formally claimed them as its own. The joining of the Combined Cadet Force at Fitzalan was the joining of the person who had been born in the garrison town and who had been formed in the household of the army surgeon and who had arrived in the borderland school with the formation that the garrison town and the army surgeon's household had produced. The formation was the formation of someone for whom the military was not the foreign country, but the familiar country, the country of the father's career and the garrison town's geography and the household's specific understanding of the world that the military produces in the families it organizes. At Fitzalan, he also met Sue Jones. She would become his first wife. They had grown up in the same borderland town and attended the same school and known each other in the specific way that the people who grow up in the same small town and attend the same school know each other. The knowledge of the person who has been in the same room since childhood and whose presence in the daily environment has produced the specific familiarity that the daily environment generates. He studied for his A-levels at Fitzalan. After the A-levels, he took a degree in sports science. The sports science degree was the degree of the person who had identified in the physical and the athletic and the specific science of the body and performance the available intellectual engagement for the formation that the Combined Cadet Force and the garrison town and the army surgeon's household had produced. Sports science was the bridge between the school formation and the military career, the academic engagement with the physical that the military career was going to require the physical of, rather than the academic. In 1987, at the age of 19, Rees enlisted in the 1st Battalion of the Parachute Regiment. The Parachute Regiment is not the ordinary available option for the person who has decided to join the British Army in the specific way that most available options are ordinary options. The Parachute Regiment is the elite airborne infantry unit of the British Army, whose specific character as the elite has been organized around the selection process that the regiment applies to the people who want to join it, which is the selection process of the person who wants to be there, being required to prove to the regiment that the regiment should want them. The proving is physical, and it is sustained, and it is the specific test of the formation that the regiment has developed across the decades of its operation, as the test that produces the regiment's membership. Rees passed the test. He became a member of the 1st Battalion of the Parachute Regiment in 1987. He was 19 years old. The garrison town and the army surgeon's household and the Combined Cadet Force and the sports science degree had produced the person who could pass the test, and the passing had produced the membership. He served one tour of duty in Northern Ireland. The Northern Ireland of the late 1980s was the Northern Ireland of the Troubles, the specific phase of the 3-decade conflict between the Republican and Loyalist paramilitaries and the British state that the army had been managing since 1969 in the specific form of Operation Banner, the British Army's deployment in Northern Ireland that was the longest continuous operational deployment in the Army's history. The Parachute Regiment had been part of the deployment since the beginning. The 1st Battalion had been part of the deployment in the specific form of the unit whose presence in the operational area required the specific skills that the Parachute Regiment's training had developed. Rees's tour in Northern Ireland produced the General Service Medal. The General Service Medal is the medal that the British Armed Forces award for service in specific operational theatres that the medal's qualifying clasp identifies, the clasp for Northern Ireland being the clasp for the specific operational theatre that Rees had served in. It is not the medal of the exceptional act, it is the medal of the service, the specific acknowledgement that the person has served in the operational theatre in the form that the service required. He served from 1987 to 1992, 5 years, 1 tour in Northern Ireland, the General Service Medal, and then he left. The leaving was the leaving of the person who had completed the service and who was now assessing the available options that the post-service world made available to the person whose formation had been the formation of the soldier and who was now the person whose soldier's formation was the asset to be deployed in the available civilian directions. The available civilian directions for the person whose formation was the formation of the parachute regiment's elite infantry were the directions of the security industry, the private security world that the post-Cold War 1990s had been expanding as the available professional world for the people whose military formation had produced the skills that the private security market was organized around purchasing. The private security market was the market that the expansion of the protection industry had created for the people whose professional formation was the formation of the military. The protection of the wealthy and the prominent and the specific category of the person whose prominence or wealth generated the specific threat that the protection was organized around preventing had been a significant market since the kidnapping for ransom industry of the 1970s and 1980s had established the specific demand for the specific product that the protection industry was supplying. Rees spent some time in the private security world in the years between his army leaving and his specific engagement with the Al Fayed organization. The specific path between the army leaving in 1992 and the Al Fayed engagement in 1995 is not documented in the available public record, with the precision that the 3 years interim would require, which is the not documented of the person whose career in the interval between the military and the celebrity security had been the career of the private security world rather than the career whose public record the public record maintains. In 1995, Rees joined the security team of Mohamed Al Fayed. Al Fayed was the Egyptian-born billionaire whose commercial empire included Harrods, the London department store, and whose family included Dodi Fayed, his son from his first marriage, whose social world was the social world of the international wealthy class of the 1990s, the world of the films and the models and the properties and the yachts, and the social occasions of the people whose wealth had produced the specific social world that the wealth of the 1990s produced for the people who had it. Rees joined as a security guard at Harrods. The Harrods posting was the posting of the person whose military formation had produced the specific qualities that the protection of the prominent commercial establishment and its owner required. He was 27 years old. He had the parachute regiment formation and the Northern Ireland tour, and the General Service Medal, and the sports science degree, and the Borderland School, and the Garrison Town origin. On the 12th of August 1995, the same year he joined Al Fayed's security, Rees married Sue Jones in Oswestry, the woman he had met at Fitzalan High School, the childhood acquaintance of the Borderland town who had been in the same rooms since they were teenagers. The marriage lasted 2 years. In June 1997, Rees filed for divorce. The filing was in June 1997. The crash was in August 1997. He was in the process of divorcing his first wife at the time of the crash that would change the rest of his life. By the summer of 1997, he had been promoted within the Al Fayed security apparatus to the position of Dodi Fayed's personal bodyguard. The promotion was the promotion of the person whose specific qualities the Al Fayed organization had identified as the qualities appropriate for the specific function of the personal protection of the son of the principal. Dodi Fayed was the son of the principal. Rees was the personal bodyguard. The relationship was the relationship of the protector and the protected. The summer of 1997 was the summer that Dodi Fayed and Diana, Princess of Wales, had become publicly visible as a couple. The relationship had been conducted in the specific glare of the international media's attention that the relationship of the heir to the Harrods' fortune and the most famous woman in the world was always going to attract in the specific media environment of the summer of 1997. The glare had produced the paparazzi presence, and the paparazzi presence had produced the specific professional conditions in which Rees and his colleague Kes Wingfield had been required to provide the protection. The specific professional conditions of the summer of 1997 were the conditions that Kes Wingfield described in his own account of the period in the terms of the 18-hour shifts on the cruise, the sustained operational demand of the protection of two very high-profile people in the specific attention environment that their relationship had generated. He and Rees had been working 18-hour shifts. They had been managing the paparazzi and the logistics and the protection of the two people whose protection the specific attention had made the most demanding available protection task in the summer of 1997. At the end of the summer, they went to Paris. The Paris of August 1997 was the Paris that the paparazzi had followed them to. The Ritz Hotel was the hotel that Mohamed Al Fayed owned and where Dodi and Diana stayed. The paparazzi surrounded the Ritz. Rees was inside with the people he was protecting. He was 29 years old. He had been a soldier. He had been a bodyguard for 2 years. He was in the process of divorcing his first wife. He was working 18-hour shifts in the summer heat of the Mediterranean and the Paris evening. He had the formation of the 1st Battalion Parachute Regiment and the General Service Medal and the specific professional training of the private security world and the combined cadet force and the garrison town and the borderland school and the sports science degree. None of it had prepared him for what the next 12 hours were going to produce. When Diana was the Princess of Wales, she had a Royal Protection Officer. The Royal Protection Officer was not the private bodyguard of the wealthy man's personal security apparatus. It was the specific product of the Metropolitan Police's Royalty Protection Group, the unit whose function was the protection of the members of the royal family in the form of the officer who had been specifically selected and specifically trained for the specific task of protecting the specific person of the royal family member whose protection had been assigned. The Royal Protection Officer's training was the training of the police officer who had been identified as the candidate for the Royalty Protection Group and who had been put through the specific preparation that the group's function required, the close protection training and the threat assessment and the advance work and the specific protocols of the royal household's engagement with the public that the protection of the royal person required to be managed in the form that the protection required. The Royal Protection Officer was the state's provision of the protection of the state's most prominent representatives. It was not a commercial transaction. The officer was assigned. The officer's loyalty was to the protection rather than to the employer in the commercial sense, because the employer in the commercial sense did not exist in the Royal Protection Officer's institutional structure. The officer was accountable to the Metropolitan Police, and through the Metropolitan Police to the state, and through the state to the specific mandate of the protection of the royal person, rather than to the person whose commercial engagement with the protection had organized the protection around the commercial relationship. The distinction between the Royal Protection Officer and the private bodyguard is the distinction between the institutional accountability of the state-provided protection and the commercial accountability of the employer-provided protection. The institutional accountability of the Royal Protection Officer produced the protection of the person who is accountable to the protection's mandate rather than the employer's wishes. The commercial accountability of the private bodyguard produced the protection of the person who is accountable to the employer's wishes rather than the protection's mandate. Rees was the private bodyguard. He was accountable to the Al Fayed organization. He was not accountable to the Metropolitan Police. He was not accountable to the Royalty Protection Group. He was not a Royal Protection Officer. He had never been a Royal Protection Officer. He was a former member of the 1st Battalion of the Parachute Regiment who had joined the Al Fayed organization's security team in 1995 and who had been assigned as Dodi Fayed's personal bodyguard in the summer of 1997. Diana did not have a Royal Protection Officer in Paris on the 31st of August 1997. She had previously had the Royal Protection Officer that the state provided for the members of the royal family whose protection the state was required to provide. After the divorce from Charles in 1996, the question of the protection had been the question of the institutional status of the divorced princess, whose institutional status the divorce had altered in the specific ways that the divorce of the Princess of Wales altered the institutional status of the person the divorce had produced. The protection had continued after the divorce in the specific form of the provision of the Royal Protection Officer. Diana had been accompanied by Ken Wharf and other Royal Protection Officers through the years of the marriage and the separation. The protection had been the protection of the state's provision for the mother of the heir to the throne, even after the divorce had altered the institutional status that had originally generated the provision. But Diana had made the decision to dispense with the Royal Protection Officers. The decision had been made in the period following the divorce and had produced the specific condition of the summer of 1997, in which Diana was in Paris with Dodi Fayed, and the protection that was available to her was the protection that the Al Fayed organization's commercial security apparatus was providing, rather than the protection that the state's institutional provision would have provided. The specific reasons for Diana's decision to dispense with the Royal Protection Officers have been examined in the accounts of the period with the attention that the decision's consequences have made the attention require. The accounts have established several contributing factors. Diana had found the Royal Protection Officer's presence in her private life intrusive in the specific way that the presence of the state-provided protection in the private life of the person who is conducting the private life produces the intrusiveness when the private life is the private life of the post-divorce period, and the state-provided protection is the state-provided protection that reports to the institution whose institutional management of the private life is the institutional management that the protection's presence makes available to the institution. The protection had reported. The protection's reporting was the reporting of the officer who is accountable to the Metropolitan Police rather than to the person being protected, and the accountability to the Metropolitan Police produced the information flow that the accountability required, the information about the protected person's movements and activities and social world that the protection's presence in the daily life generated as the natural byproduct of the presence. Diana had understood the reporting as the reporting that the institution was using to manage the information about her post-divorce private life in the direction of the institutional management rather than the direction of the protection's mandate. The understanding was the understanding that the accounts of the period have established as Diana's specific assessment of the situation, the assessment that the protection was the institutional surveillance as much as the institutional protection, and that the surveillance was the surveillance that the post-divorce management of her public image required to be dispensed with in the form of the protection's dispense. She dispensed with the state protection. She was in Paris with the Al Fayed organization's commercial security. The Al Fayed commercial security in Paris, on the night of the 30th and 31st of August 1997, consisted of two people, Trevor Rees-Jones and Kes Wingfield, two bodyguards for two principals in the city, with the highest paparazzi density of any available location for the couple whose relationship had been the most covered available story of the summer of 1997, two bodyguards. The standard close protection protocol for two principals of this profile in this environment would have been the protocol of the larger team, the advanced team, and the route planning, and the counter-surveillance, and the coordination with local law enforcement, and the secure vehicles, and the specific layered protection that the specific threat environment required. This was not the protection that the two bodyguards constituted. The two bodyguards constituted the minimum available provision for the protection task that the situation had produced. Kes Wingfield later said at the inquest, "If we were allowed to have done our jobs properly by the organization, we wouldn't be having this conversation now." The organization was the Al Fayed organization. The jobs were the jobs that the close protection standard would have required. The not being allowed was the not being allowed of the employer whose decisions about the security arrangements had produced the arrangements rather than the arrangements that the security professionals would have produced if the decisions had been the professionals' decisions rather than the employers'. The employer's decisions had produced Henri Paul. Henri Paul was the deputy head of security at the Ritz Hotel. He was not a bodyguard. He was not a close protection officer. He was the deputy head of security of the hotel, whose function was the hotel's security, rather than the personal protection of the hotel's guests, in the form that the personal protection of the guests requires the specific training that the close protection function provides. He was 41 years old. He had a pilot's license. He liked to drink. At 7 p.m. on the 30th of August, Henri Paul went off duty. His shift had ended. He was not required for the rest of the evening. The couple were in the hotel. The hotel's security was operating. The evening was the evening of the hotel's management, rather than the evening of Henri Paul's specific function. At 10:08 p.m., Henri Paul was recalled to the hotel. The recall was produced by the decision that Dodi Fayed had made about the departure from the hotel. The decision that Henri Paul would drive the couple from the back of the Ritz in a decoy vehicle operation that Henri Paul had designed to evade the paparazzi who were surrounding the hotel. The recall was the recall of the person whose function was the hotel's security to the function of the driver of the couple's vehicle. In the interval between the 7 p.m. going off duty and the 10:08 p.m. recall, Henri Paul had been drinking. The subsequent investigation established that Henri Paul had drunk the equivalent of the alcohol level that the French legal limit for driving identified as 3 times the legal limit. His blood alcohol level was 3 times the legal limit. He had also been taking prescription medication, Prozac and Thiopridol, an antidepressant and an antipsychotic medication respectively, whose interaction with the alcohol produced the specific physiological condition of the person who was 3 times over the legal alcohol limit, and whose medication's interaction with the alcohol was the interaction of the medications that the prescribing instructions had warned against conducting in the presence of the alcohol. He came back to the hotel at 10:08 p.m. He went to the Bar Vendôme. At 10:43 p.m., he was in the Bar Vendôme with Rees-Jones. They left the bar together approximately 25 minutes later. Rees-Jones was with Henri Paul in the Bar Vendôme. Rees-Jones did not believe Henri Paul was drunk. He said at the inquest that there was nothing in Henri Paul's demeanor that indicated he had been drinking. Henri Paul was apparently not displaying the physical indicators of the intoxication that 3 times the legal limit produces in the person who has developed the specific tolerance of the regular drinker for the physical presentation of the intoxication. The regular drinker's tolerance produces the concealed intoxication, the physical presentation of the not obviously drunk that the blood alcohol content of 3 times the legal limit would otherwise produce in the person who had not developed the tolerance. Henri Paul had developed the tolerance. Rees-Jones did not see it. He said his focus of attention that evening was getting a sandwich down my neck as soon as possible and getting back on the job. This was Wingfield's account rather than Rees-Jones's, but it captured the specific quality of the 2 bodyguards' situation at that point in the evening, which was the situation of the people who have been working 18-hour shifts and who are managing the professional demands of the protection task in the specific state of the sustained operational fatigue. They were tired. Henri Paul was drunk and medicated. The paparazzi were outside. Dodi had a plan. The plan was the decoy plan. A Range Rover and a Mercedes would leave from the front of the hotel as the decoy. The couple would leave from the back in a second Mercedes, driven by Henri Paul, with Rees-Jones in the front passenger seat. The paparazzi would follow the decoy. The couple would escape. Rees-Jones was not happy with the plan. He said so at the inquest. He had advised using 2 vehicles from the front of the hotel, where the security could control the environment and where the crowd and the press would be pushed back across the road. He had been told initially that Dodi and Diana would travel without security, which he had refused. He had then been told the plan was the backdoor Henri Paul plan. He went along with it. He said he went along with it. The bodyguard who was not happy with the plan went along with it because the bodyguard in the commercial security relationship goes along with the employer's decision when the employer's decision is the employer's decision rather than the security professional's recommendation. This is the specific dimension of the commercial accountability versus the institutional accountability that the Royal Protection Officer structure had been designed to prevent. The Royal Protection Officer would not have gone along with it. The Royal Protection Officer's institutional accountability was the accountability that gave the Royal Protection Officer the specific authority to override the principal's preference in the specific situation where the principal's preference was the preference that the protection mandate required to be overridden. Rees did not have that authority. He was the commercial bodyguard. The employer had made the decision. He went along with it. This is not the same thing as saying that Rees was responsible for what happened. He was not responsible. The responsibility for what happened has been established by the investigations, the drunk driver, the excessive speed, the paparazzi, the tunnel. But the specific conditions that produced what happened included the condition of the commercial bodyguard who could not override the employer's decision and who went along with the plan he was not happy with, because the plan was the employer's plan. He went along with it. He got in the front seat. He was not happy. The man who was not happy with the plan was about to lose 3 minutes of his memory and every bone in his face. The timeline of the final hours before the crash has been reconstructed from the Ritz Hotel's surveillance footage, from the witness accounts of the hotel staff, from the accounts of the paparazzi who were outside and who documented what they saw in the form that the paparazzi's function is organized around documenting, and from the subsequent investigations, the French investigation, the British Operation Paget, and the 2008 inquest at the Royal Courts of Justice. The reconstruction is as complete as the available evidence permits. It is not complete in the form that the full understanding of what happened in those hours requires, because the reconstruction has a specific gap in it that the available evidence cannot fill, which is the gap of the 3 minutes between the back of the Ritz and the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. But the hours before the 3 minutes are documented. They are documented in the specific detail that the surveillance cameras and the hotel staff and the paparazzi and the subsequent investigations have produced as the available picture of the last hours of 3 of the 4 people in the car. At 4:35 p.m. on the 30th of August 1997, Diana and Dodi entered the Ritz Hotel through the revolving back door, accompanied by Rees-Jones. They took the elevator to the first floor and entered the Imperial Suite. The Imperial Suite was the hotel's most significant available accommodation, the suite of the hotel that was owned by Mohamed Al Fayed, and whose most significant available accommodation was the available accommodation for the son of the owner and the woman the son of the owner had been photographed with on the yachts and the beaches of the summer of 1997. At 5:42 p.m., Dodi and Rees-Jones drove to the Repossi Jewelers on the Place Vendôme. The Place Vendôme is the specific address of the specific jeweler whose specific function in the story of the last hours has become the most contested detail of the last hours, the detail around which the conspiracy theories and the romantic accounts and the competing claims about the relationship's intentions have organized themselves since August 1997. Dodi returned from the Repossi visit, holding a brochure. The brochure was from Repossi. A member of the Repossi staff later brought 2 rings to the Imperial Suite. The surveillance footage of the Repossi visit and the subsequent bringing of the rings to the suite was the footage that Mohamed Al Fayed deployed in the construction of the argument that Dodi had been planning to propose to Diana, the engagement ring argument that Al Fayed maintained across the years following the crash as the specific detail that established the motive for the murder that Al Fayed was alleging. The engagement ring argument was the argument of the father who had lost his son and who had organized the account of the loss around the narrative of the stolen future, the engagement and the marriage and the child that Al Fayed claimed Diana had been carrying, and the entire future that the crash had ended. The narrative required the engagement ring. The Repossi visit and the brochure and the 2 rings brought to the suite were the evidence that the narrative deployed as the engagement ring's establishment. Rees-Jones later disputed the engagement ring theory. He said in his book and in subsequent interviews that he had seen no evidence during the summer of 1997 that Dodi was planning to propose. He had been Dodi's personal bodyguard. He had been present in Dodi's daily life during the summer. He had not seen the planning of the proposal that the engagement ring theory required. Whether the visit to Repossi was the visit for the engagement ring or the visit for a different piece of jewelry has not been definitively established in the public record. What is established is the visit and the brochure and the rings brought to the suite. What is not established is the intention that the visit represented. At 7 p.m., Henri Paul went off duty. He had completed his shift. He left the hotel. At 6:53 p.m., the couple had left the Ritz and been driven to Dodi's apartment near the Arc de Triomphe. They spent the early part of the evening at the apartment. At 9:51 p.m., they returned to the Ritz via the front entrance and went toward the restaurant, where they stayed until 10:01 p.m. At 10:08 p.m., Henri Paul was recalled to the hotel. He had been gone for approximately 3 hours. In those 3 hours, he had been drinking. At 10:30 p.m., the surveillance footage recorded Henri Paul making the first of 5 trips to the Place Vendôme in front of the hotel. On the last 3 of the 5 trips, he spoke to the paparazzi who were stationed outside. The speaking to the paparazzi is the detail that the subsequent investigations examined, with the specific attention that the detail deserves, when the detail is the detail of the hotel's deputy head of security speaking to the photographers outside the hotel, where the people he was about to drive were staying. What he said to the paparazzi has not been established in the form that the establishment would require. The paparazzi who received the conversations have not produced accounts of the conversations that the investigations have accepted as the complete and the reliable account of what passed between Henri Paul and the photographers in the 5 trips to the Place Vendôme. What is established is the 5 trips and the conversations with the photographers on 3 of them. At 10:43 p.m., Henri Paul entered the bar Vendôme. He was in the bar with Rees-Jones. They left together approximately 25 minutes later. At 11:51 p.m., a test run was conducted. A Mercedes and a Range Rover were sent out on a dummy run to test the reaction of the paparazzi to the vehicles leaving the hotel. The dummy run was the advance reconnaissance of the decoy plan, the assessment of how the paparazzi would respond to the vehicle's departure before the actual departure occurred with the couple inside. The paparazzi responded. They followed the vehicles. The test run established that the decoy plan would produce the following response. The Range Rover and the Mercedes left. The paparazzi followed. The decoy worked in the test. Whether it would work in the actual departure was the question that the test run was designed to address. The test run also established that the paparazzi were alert, organized, and equipped with the vehicles and the motorcycle escorts that the mobile pursuit required. They were not the stationary photographers of the earlier Ritz period. They were the mobile pursuit unit of the specific paparazzi operation, whose commercial function was organized around the photographs of Diana and Dodi, that the commercial market for those photographs would pay the specific sums that the Diana photographs commanded in the summer of 1997. The Diana photographs commanded extraordinary sums. The estimates of the value of the exclusive photographs of Diana and Dodi in a compromising or intimate context have been placed by the accounts of the period at the hundreds of thousands of pounds for the single photograph. The hundreds of thousands of pounds for the single photograph was the commercial incentive that organized the mobile pursuit unit's operation outside the Ritz on the night of the 30th and 31st of August. After the test run, the plan was finalized. At 12:06 a.m., Diana and Dodi left the Imperial Suite and went to the hotel's back service exit to wait for the car. The surveillance cameras at the back service exit recorded what was happening. Diana was in a dark jacket and dark trousers. Dodi was beside her. They were waiting for the car. His left arm was lightly around her waist. Their heads were touching. They waited for approximately 7 minutes. The last photographs of Diana alive were taken at the back service exit of the Ritz Hotel. The photographs were taken by a photographer who had positioned himself to capture the couple's departure. The photographs show Diana's face in the moment of the waiting, the specific quality of the person who is in the back service exit of a hotel, waiting for a car that has not yet arrived, and who is managing the specific impatience of the waiting, in the specific way that the person who has been waiting all evening, in the specific conditions of the paparazzi siege, manages the impatience. She was in good spirits by the accounts of the hotel staff who saw her in those final minutes. She had been in good spirits through the evening. Whatever the summer had been, the relationship with Dodi, the paparazzi, the discussions about the future, the Repossi visit, the person in the surveillance footage and in the last photographs was the person who was managing the evening in the specific way that the person in good spirits manages the evening. At 12:12 a.m., Henri Paul was outside checking for the car, exiting and re-entering the hotel through the back service exit. He spotted two photographers across the street, Serge Benamou and Jacques Langevin, who had identified the back exit as the departure point. Henri Paul waved at them. He went back inside. He waved at the photographers who were about to follow the car that he was about to drive. At 12:14 a.m., Henri Paul re-entered the hotel and stood near the rear door. At 12:20 a.m., the black Mercedes S280 arrived at the back service exit. Henri Paul was at the wheel. Rees-Jones took the front passenger seat. Dodi and Diana got into the back. As they left, Henri Paul called out to the photographers, "Don't try to follow us. You will never catch us." He was wrong. They followed. They were very fast. Rees-Jones's last true memory was formed at this point, the memory of climbing into the car at the back of the Ritz, the moment of the departure, the black car, the back of the Ritz, the paparazzi across the street, Henri Paul's words to the photographers. After that point, everything that Rees-Jones could have told the world about what happened in the 12 minutes between leaving the Ritz and entering the Pont de l'Alma tunnel is the information that the head injury of the crash produced as the absence rather than the presence. The memory that ends at the departure is the memory that the world has been trying to fill for 27 years. The 12 minutes were the 12 minutes of the car traveling through the Paris streets with the paparazzi in pursuit. The Mercedes was traveling faster than it should have been. Henri Paul was driving faster than the situation required, and faster than the road permitted, and faster than the blood alcohol content and the medication permitted him to drive. The paparazzi were behind. The decoy had not worked, or had worked for a period and then failed, and the photographers who had identified the back departure had been following from the moment of the departure. 12 minutes. The Ritz to the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. The tunnel is the tunnel that runs beneath the Place de l'Alma in the 8th arrondissement of Paris, carrying the road that follows the right bank of the Seine. The specific geometry of the tunnel, the concrete pillars, the road surface, the entry angle, the exit, was the specific geography that the car entered at 12:23 a.m. Inside the car, 3 of the 4 people did not know what was about to happen. Henri Paul was driving. Dodi was in the back. Diana was in the back. Rees-Jones was in the front passenger seat. Rees-Jones's last true memory was the departure from the Ritz. What happened next is the thing that he cannot tell. The Mercedes S280 entered the Pont de l'Alma tunnel at approximately 12:23 a.m. on the 31st of August 1997. The speed at the point of entry has been established by the investigations as approximately 96 miles per hour, 155 kilometers per hour. The speed limit in the tunnel is 30 miles per hour. The Mercedes was traveling at more than 3 times the permitted speed. The tunnel has a specific geometry that the accident reconstruction has examined in the detail that the forensic examination of the accident scene requires. The entry to the tunnel from the east is the entry that the Mercedes took, the specific approach of the car that was traveling along the right bank of the Seine and that entered the tunnel through the specific configuration of the entry that the tunnel's design had organized. The tunnel curves to the left as the road follows the riverbank. The curve is the specific challenge of the speed. The car whose speed at the entry is the speed that the curve's geometry cannot accommodate at that speed in the specific way that the physics of the curve and the speed interact. Henri Paul lost control of the car. The loss of control was the loss that the specific combination of the speed and the curve and the blood alcohol content and the medication produced when the combination met the specific geometry of the Pont de l'Alma tunnel's entry. The investigations have established the loss of control as the proximate cause of the crash in the specific sense of the thing that preceded the impact and that the impact was the consequence of. The car struck the 13th concrete support pillar in the tunnel, the 13th pillar. The specific pillar that the car's trajectory, the trajectory of the losing control at 96 miles per hour in the curving tunnel, produced as the point of the impact. The 13th pillar was in the specific position in the tunnel that the trajectory had reached when the trajectory met the structure. The impact was at the 13th pillar. The forensic examination of the impact has established the speed, the angle, the force, and the specific distribution of the physical consequences of the impact across the 4 people in the car. The force of the impact at 96 miles per hour against a concrete support pillar is the force whose specific character the accident reconstruction has quantified, in the terms of the deceleration and the structural damage and the human injury pattern, that the impact at that force produces in the people inside the vehicle at the moment of the impact. Dodi Fayed died at the scene. His injuries were the injuries of the person in the rear passenger seat on the side of the car that the impact had produced the most severe structural deformation in. The structural deformation of the rear of the vehicle at the point of the impact was the structural deformation that the force of the impact at 96 miles per hour against the pillar produced in the rear of the vehicle. Dodi's injuries were not survivable. He was pronounced dead at the scene by the emergency services who arrived after the crash. Henri Paul died at the scene. His injuries were the injuries of the driver, whose position at the wheel placed him in the most direct relationship to the impact's force, the driver's seat being the position closest to the front of the vehicle, and therefore the position most directly exposed to the specific force of the deceleration that the impact at the pillar produced. Henri Paul's injuries were the injuries of the person who was most directly in the path of the impact's force. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Diana was alive after the impact. The forensic evidence of the crash and the accounts of the first people at the scene have established that Diana was conscious and that she was speaking in the immediate aftermath of the impact. She was alive. She was not immediately fatally injured by the crash itself. She was injured, seriously, severely, but she was alive, and she was conscious, and she was speaking. Rees-Jones was alive. He was in the front passenger seat. He was conscious, but unable to speak in the immediate aftermath of the impact. He had sustained catastrophic injuries to his face, every bone in his face broken, the jaw shattered, the facial structure destroyed by the impact that the front passenger seat's position in the vehicle and the vehicle's impact with the pillar had produced. He had a tracking tube out of his throat, which meant he could not make any sound. He told CNN in 2000, "I had a tracking tube out of my throat, so I couldn't make any sound." He was trapped in the wreckage. The front passenger seat of the Mercedes was the seat closest to the pillar that the car had struck, the 13th pillar on the left side of the tunnel. The front passenger side of the vehicle had received the impact's force in the specific way that the vehicle's trajectory into the pillar had directed the force toward the front passenger side. Rees-Jones was on the front passenger side. He was trapped. He was conscious. He could not make a sound. The photographers were the first people to arrive at the scene. This is the specific biographical detail of the crash's immediate aftermath, that the subsequent legal proceedings against the photographers, the 9 photographers and 1 motorcycle driver, who were detained in France on suspicion of manslaughter and failing to render assistance to a person in danger, were organized around. The photographers arrived before the emergency services. They were present at the scene before the ambulances, and before the fire service, and before the police. They were there with their cameras. The question of what the photographers did in the time between their arrival and the arrival of the emergency services was the question that the French legal proceedings were required to examine. The question was the question of the obligation to render assistance, the specific legal provision of the French law that required the person who is present at the scene of the accident and who has the capacity to render assistance to the injured to render the assistance rather than to perform the other available activity. The other available activity was taking photographs. Several of the photographers were alleged to have taken photographs of the injured people in the car rather than rendering the assistance that the French law required. The legal proceedings that followed the crash examined the photographers' actions in the tunnel in the specific form of the question of whether the photographing had been conducted in place of the assisting, or alongside it, or after it, and in what sequence the photographing and the assisting had occurred. The proceedings were eventually dropped. The investigating judges concluded that there was insufficient evidence to proceed against the photographers on the manslaughter charges. The failing to render assistance charges were also dropped. The photographers were released. The legal proceedings against the photographers produced the legal outcome of the not prosecuted. Mohamed Al Fayed maintained that the photographers' arrival and their photographing, rather than assisting, had been a contributing factor to Diana's death. The argument was the argument of the father, who had identified in the photographer's presence and activity the contribution to the failure to provide the immediate medical assistance that the immediate medical assistance might have produced as the difference between the outcome that occurred and the outcome that the immediate assistance might have prevented. The French emergency medical system's response to the crash was the response that the system produced, the SAMU, the Service d'aide médicale urgente, which is the French emergency medical service, whose specific protocols for the management of the trauma patient at the scene of the accident are the protocols of the physician-led response, rather than the paramedic-led response that the British system deploys. The French SAMU physician who attended Diana at the scene assessed her injuries and managed her treatment in the tunnel before her transportation to the hospital. The treatment in the tunnel was the treatment that the SAMU's protocols required. The stabilization of the patient at the scene before the transport to the hospital, rather than the immediate transport to the hospital that the British system deploys as the scoop and run protocol. The French system's stay and play versus the British system's scoop and run. Diana was treated in the tunnel for approximately 40 minutes before she was moved to the ambulance. She was transported to the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital. The transport was conducted at the pace that the SAMU's protocols required, the careful transport of the stabilized patient rather than the emergency speed of the scoop and run. The transport took approximately 40 minutes from the scene to the hospital. She arrived at the Pitié-Salpêtrière at 2:06 a.m. She was taken directly to the operating theatre. The surgeons attempted to repair the damage. The damage was the damage of the traumatic rupture of the pulmonary vein, the specific cardiac injury of the crash, whose severity the operating theatre's examination had established as the injury that the surgery was required to address. The pulmonary vein injury was the specific fatal injury, not the brain injury, not the chest injuries, the pulmonary vein. The surgery lasted approximately 2 hours. The surgeons were unable to repair the rupture. Diana died at 4 a.m. on the 31st of August 1997. She was 36 years old. Rees-Jones was in the tunnel when Diana died. He was in the wreckage of the front passenger seat. He had been extracted from the wreckage by the emergency services and had been transported to the Pitié-Salpêtrière alongside Diana, the same hospital, the same transport, the same arrival in the early hours of the 31st of August. He was not aware of Diana's death at the time of her death. He was not aware of very much at the time of her death. He was in the specific condition that the catastrophic facial injuries and the trauma of the impact had produced in the person who had been in the front passenger seat of the Mercedes when the Mercedes had struck the 13th concrete pillar at 96 miles per hour. He was conscious when he arrived at the hospital. He was able to communicate only by whispering and writing. The tracking tube had been the tracking tube of the emergency treatment in the tunnel. At the hospital, the assessment of his injuries produced the specific picture of the damage that the impact had imposed on the person in the front passenger seat, the catastrophic facial injuries, and the chest trauma, and the brain injury, and the specific combination of the damages that the forensic examination of his injuries established as the injuries of the sole survivor of the Pont de l'Alma crash. Every bone in his face was broken. The surgeon who first assessed him, working in the Paris hospital that was simultaneously managing the treatment of Diana, said he had never seen so many fractures on a man who was still alive. The specific form of the survival that produced the person with every bone in his face broken but who was alive was the survival whose mechanism the investigations have examined in the context of the early reports that he had survived because he was wearing a seatbelt. The seatbelt theory was the theory that organized the initial coverage of the survival. The sole survivor was the survivor who had been wearing the seatbelt that the others had not been wearing. The seatbelt as the mechanism of the survival was the legible narrative of the crash whose other 3 occupants had died. The 2006 Operation Paget investigation established that none of the 4 occupants had been wearing a seatbelt. Not Rees-Jones, not Diana, not Dodi, not Henri Paul, none of them. The seatbelt theory was wrong. The specific mechanism of Rees-Jones's survival was not the seatbelt. The investigations have pointed to the airbag as the mechanism, the front passenger airbag, whose deployment at the moment of the impact had provided the specific physical protection that the airbag provides to the front passenger in the vehicle whose front passenger airbag deploys at the moment of the crash. The airbag, not the seatbelt, the airbag that no one had worn. The survival of the person in the front passenger seat was the survival that the airbag had produced alongside the specific geometry of the impact, whose force had been most catastrophic at the rear of the vehicle, at Dodi's position, and had produced the specific distribution of the survival chance across the 4 positions in the car in the form that the crash's geometry had distributed it. Dodi had been in the worst position, Henri Paul had been in the second worst, Diana had been in the third, Rees-Jones had been in the fourth, the front passenger seat with the airbag, the position from which the crash's geometry had produced the survival rather than the death, at the cost of every bone in his face. He was alive. He had no memory of how. He was in a coma for 10 days. The coma was the induced coma that the medical management of the catastrophic brain injury and the catastrophic facial injury and the catastrophic chest trauma required, as the management of the patient whose injuries had been the injuries of the person in the front passenger seat of the Mercedes that had struck the 13th concrete support pillar at 96 miles per hour. The induced coma is the specific medical intervention that the management of the most severe available injuries deploys when the management requires the brain to be relieved of the metabolic demands of consciousness in order for the brain to direct its available resources toward the specific healing that the injuries require. The 10 days were the 10 days of the specific management of the injuries in the form that the injuries required. The world outside the coma was the world of the 36 hours between the crash and the specific moment when the coma was induced, the world in which Diana had been pronounced dead at 4:00 a.m. on the 31st of August, and in which the Queen had not yet come back to London, and in which the flowers were beginning to arrive outside Kensington Palace, and in which the most significant events in the history of the British monarchy's public image were beginning to unfold in the specific way that the days between the 31st of August and the 6th of September 1997 unfolded them. Rees-Jones was not in that world. He was in the coma. The coma was the available world. It was the world of the person who had been in the front passenger seat and who was now in the managed darkness of the induced unconsciousness that the medical management had organized as the available world for the recovery of the person whose injuries required the recovery. The injury to his face was the most immediately visible dimension of the physical damage that the crash had produced. The surgeons at the Pitié-Salpêtrière who examined the injury were the surgeons who produced the specific assessments of the damage that the examinations required. The surgeon who first assessed the facial injuries said that the face was completely smashed and crushed. He added that he had never seen so many fractures on a man who was still alive. The face that had been completely smashed and crushed was the face that required the specific reconstruction that the completely smashed and crushed face requires. The surgical reassembly of the facial structure from the available material and the additional material that the surgical reconstruction provides in the form of the titanium components that the facial reconstruction deploys when the available material is insufficient for the reassembly. The reconstruction required 150 titanium parts, 150. The specific number of the titanium components that the reconstruction of the face of the person whose every facial bone had been broken required to reassemble the face into the form that the face required to be reassembled into. The titanium parts are the structural replacements for the bone structure that the impact had destroyed. The specific components of the facial architecture that the reconstruction produces from titanium rather than from the bone that the impact has made unavailable as the material. The reconstruction required a photograph. This is the specific biographical detail that has been preserved in the accounts of the procedure as the detail that most precisely establishes the scale of the damage that the reconstruction was required to address. The surgeons who were reassembling the face required the photograph of the face before the damage, because the face after the damage was not the face from which the target of the reconstruction could be derived. The target of the reconstruction required the photograph. The photograph provided the target. Working from the photograph, and with 150 titanium parts, the surgeons reassembled the face. The 10-hour operation that the reassembly required was the 10-hour operation of the surgical work that the scope of the reconstruction imposed on the surgeons who were doing it. 10 hours, working from a photograph, using 150 titanium parts to rebuild the structure that the 13th pillar had destroyed. The tongue rumor circulated in the hours following the crash. There were reports, widely circulated in the media coverage of the crash's immediate aftermath, that Rees-Jones had lost his tongue in the impact, that the tracking tube in his throat had been the replacement for the tongue that the crash had removed. The tracking tube had been the tube in his throat. The tube in his throat had been interpreted as the evidence of the tongue's loss. The tongue's loss was the rumor. The tongue was not lost. This is the established fact of the medical record. His tongue was not removed by the crash, and was not a casualty of the injuries that the crash had produced. The tracking tube was the tracking tube of the emergency airway management that the catastrophic facial injuries required. The maintenance of the airway in the person whose facial injuries had compromised the airway in the specific way that the catastrophic facial injuries compromised the airway of the injured person. The tracking tube was in the throat. The tongue was not lost. When he came out of the coma after 10 days, he could communicate only by whispering and writing. The whispering was the whispering of the person whose vocal capacity had been limited by the injuries and the surgical procedures that had produced the available vocal capacity as the whisper rather than the full voice. The writing was the writing of the person for whom the whisper was insufficient for the communication that the recovery from the coma required, and who was therefore supplementing the whisper with the written word in the specific form of the person who is writing rather than speaking, because the speaking is not the available communication. He did not know what had happened. The coming out of the coma was not the coming out of the coma into the knowledge of what had happened in the 12 minutes between the departure from the Ritz and the 13th pillar. The coming out of the coma was the coming out into the absence of the knowledge, the specific condition of the person who is waking from 10 days of the induced unconsciousness and who is discovering the specific state of the available world as the world of the recovery rather than the world of the event. The discovery of what had happened was the discovery that the people around him produced as the discovery, the information provided to the person who is recovering from the coma about the events that had produced the coma. His mother Gil was with him. She had come to Paris when she received the news of the crash. She had been the presence in the period of the coma, the mother who had arrived at the hospital where her son was in the coma, and who had managed the specific experience of the parent, who is at the bedside of the child in the coma, and who is managing the uncertainty of the coma's outcome, in the form that the uncertainty of the coma's outcome requires to be managed. Gil's description of her son's face in the aftermath of the crash and the reconstruction has been preserved in the accounts of the period, in the specific form of the maternal description that the mother produces when she is describing the appearance of the child, whose face has been rebuilt from a photograph using 150 titanium parts. She said it looked like it had been hit by a frying pan in a Tom and Jerry cartoon, smashed back and flattened. The Tom and Jerry cartoon frying pan. The maternal description of the completely smashed and crushed face, in the terms that the maternal description of the thing the maternal description is required to describe produces. He bore the scars of the reconstruction across the subsequent years. The scars were visible at the 2008 inquest. The journalists and the legal professionals and the members of the public who attended the inquest at the Royal Courts of Justice in January 2008 could see the scars on the face of the man who was testifying about the crash he could not remember. The scars were the permanent record of the reconstruction, the visible evidence of the 150 titanium parts and the 10-hour operation and the photograph that the surgeons had worked from. He spent more than a month in the hospital in Paris. The month was the month of the recovery from the coma and the surgical procedures and the specific physiological demands of the recovery from the catastrophic injuries. He was in the Pitié-Salpêtrière for more than a month, the same hospital where Diana had been treated. Where Diana had died at 4 a.m. on the 31st of August. He was in the same hospital for more than a month after the crash that had killed her. He returned to the United Kingdom on the 3rd of October 1997, 33 days after the crash. He was able to communicate by whispering and writing. The whispering and the writing were the available communication of the person who was returning to the UK with the injuries that the return was organised around the management of. He came back to England in the specific condition of the person who had been in the tunnel, and who had survived the tunnel, and who was returning from the hospital where the tunnel had sent him. His mother and stepfather, Gil and Ernie, received him. He went to the family home in Oswestry. The borderland town where he had grown up. The town where he had met Sue Jones at Fitzgerald High School and had married her and had filed for divorce in June 1997, and who was now, in October 1997, 33 days after the crash, the ex-wife, or the almost ex-wife, or the divorcing wife, of the man who had come back from Paris with the titanium face and the lost memory. The return to Oswestry was the return of the person whose available world was now the available world of the mother and the stepfather and the borderland town and the recovery. It was not the available world of the bodyguard. It was not the available world of the Al Fayed organization. It was not the available world of the man who had been in the front passenger seat. It was the available world of the recovery from being that man, the Oswestry house, and the mother, and the stepfather, and the whispering and the writing, and the titanium face, and the lost memory, and the specific condition of the person who had survived what the three other people in the car had not survived. He had survived. He did not know how. He did not remember the moment of the survival, or the moments before the survival, or the moments after the survival, in the form of the memory that the survival would normally produce in the person who has survived. He had the whispering, and the writing, and the titanium face, and the Oswestry house, and the mother, and the stepfather. He did not have the memory. The memory was the thing that the brain injury had removed from the available world, along with the 3 minutes before the pillar, and the 12 minutes in the car, and the several hours before the car. The memory was not available. The recovery would proceed without it. The world would ask for it regardless. The medical term for what happened to Trevor Rees-Jones's memory is retrograde amnesia. Retrograde amnesia is the specific form of the memory loss that the traumatic brain injury produces when the injury is the injury to the brain structures that the encoding and the retrieval of the recent memories requires, the hippocampus, and the associated structures of the medial temporal lobe, whose function in the memory system is the function of the consolidation of the recent experience into the retrievable form that the memory requires to be the memory, rather than the experience that did not become the memory. The retrograde in retrograde amnesia refers to the direction of the loss of the memories that were formed before the injury, rather than the loss of the capacity to form new memories after the injury. The brain injury that produces retrograde amnesia produces the loss of the specific period of the recent past that the injury has retroactively removed from the retrievable memory, the period that ends at the moment of the injury and that extends back into the period before the injury for the duration that the injury's severity and the specific brain structures affected determine as the duration of the loss. For Rees-Jones, the duration of the retrograde amnesia was the duration that the accounts of the period have described in two slightly different forms. Some accounts describe the loss as the loss of the 4 hours before the crash, the 4 hours that would have included the bar Vendôme and the 10:43 p.m. departure from the bar, and the decoy plan, and the waiting at the back service exit, and the 7 minutes with Diana and Dodi, and the departure. Other accounts describe the loss as the loss of approximately the 4 minutes immediately before the crash, the specific period between climbing into the car at the back of the Ritz and the impact in the tunnel. At the 2008 inquest, Rees-Jones provided the most precise available statement of what his last true memory was. He said, "I have no memory of, after leaving the back of the hotel. That's my last true memory. The leaving the back of the hotel. The memory ends at the departure. Everything after the departure, the car moving through Paris, Henri Paul calling out to the photographers, the Mercedes entering the streets, the pursuit, the tunnel, the pillar, is the absence rather than the presence in the memory of the person whose last true memory is the departure from the back of the Ritz. The absence has a specific character that is different from the absence of the memory of the thing that did not happen to you. The thing happened to him. He was there. He was in the front passenger seat. He was in the tunnel. He was present at the moment of the impact, and in the moments preceding the impact, and in the moments following the impact. He was there for all of it. The memory of all of it is gone. He said the sentence that has been the most quoted sentence of the entire investigation into Diana's death, from the position of the person who was there. "I'm the only person who can tell people for real, and I can't remember." The sentence is the sentence of the specific frustration of the person who understands the significance of the knowledge they do not have. He is the only living person who was in the car. He is the only living person who could tell the world what happened in the 12 minutes between the departure from the Ritz and the 13th pillar. He is the only living person who could tell the world whether Henri Paul showed signs of the intoxication before the crash. He is the only living person who could tell the world what speed the car was traveling, what Henri Paul said, what Diana said, what the tunnel looked like in the 12 minutes before the impact. He cannot tell any of it. He is the only person who can tell it for real, and he cannot tell it. The flashbacks arrived in the months after the crash. There were 2 of them. He described the first in an interview with the Daily Mirror in the period before the publication of his book. I have had flashes of a female voice calling out in the back of the car. First it's a groan, then Dodi's name is called. It could only have been Princess Diana. I was conscious, and so was she. The groan, then Dodi's name. The female voice calling out from the back of the car. If the flashback is accurate, if it is the genuine memory of the specific moment in the crash's aftermath when Diana was conscious and calling out, it is the most intimate available record of Diana in the final conscious moments of her life. The groan, and then the name. Dodi, her voice, immediately after the impact, calling the name of the man in the back seat with her. He described the second flashback at the 2008 inquest. In the second flashback, he said, he recalled seeing a paparazzi motorbike next to the car. The motorbike next to the car. The image of the motorcycle in the peripheral vision of the front passenger seat, in the moments before or after or during the crash, visible to him in the flashback's form. His psychiatrist was Dr. Maurice Lipsedge. Dr. Lipsedge examined both flashbacks. Dr. Lipsedge told the court at the 2008 inquest that the 2 flashbacks were false memories. False memories. Not the genuine memories that the flashback form suggests to the person experiencing them. The false memories that the traumatically injured brain produces from the available material, the material of the experience, and the knowledge, and the suggestion, and the information that the brain assembles in the form of the memory, even when the memory is not the memory of the thing that was experienced, but the memory of the brain's construction of what the experience might have been. The traumatically injured brain's capacity for false memory production is the specific dimension of the traumatic brain injury's effect on the memory system that the neuroscientific research has established as the dimension requiring the careful examination of the recovered memory of the traumatic event. The recovered memory of the traumatic event is not automatically the accurate memory of the traumatic event. The recovered memory of the traumatic event may be the false memory, the brain's production of the plausible account of the experience, rather than the actual account. Dr. Lipsedge's assessment that the 2 flashbacks were false memories was the assessment of the psychiatrist who had examined the flashbacks in the context of the medical history and the injury's specific character and the specific form that the false memories of traumatic experience take in the person whose brain has been damaged, in the form that Rees-Jones's brain had been damaged. The false memories were not invented in the simple sense. They were the brain's production of the available material, in the form that the brain injury produces the available material, the groan, and the name from the back seat, the motorbike next to the car, assembled from the knowledge and the suggestion and the available information, rather than from the actual experience of the tunnel. Dr. Lipsedge said at the inquest that the chances of Rees-Jones recovering his memory were slight. Slight. Not impossible, not zero, slight. The specific medical assessment of the probability that the person whose brain had been injured in the form that the crash had injured it would recover the specific memories that the injury had removed was the assessment of slight. The slight is the medical assessment's honesty about the available probability when the available probability is the probability that the traumatic brain injury's retrograde amnesia does not produce the recovery, and that the psychiatrist's examination of the available evidence does not support the optimism that the recovery will occur. He said in an interview, "To start with, I couldn't remember a thing, and doctors weren't sure if I would ever remember. I had amnesia, everything was just a blank. My psychiatrist calls them windows of memory. They are small and don't last very long. The windows of memory, the small windows, the windows that don't last very long." The specific metaphor that the person who has the small windows and the not lasting describes the experience of the memory loss in the terms that the experience of the memory loss requires. The window that opens briefly and closes before the person who is looking through it can see what is on the other side. The other side of the window was the 3 minutes between the departure from the back of the Ritz and the 13th concrete pillar. The window opened briefly in the form of the 2 flashbacks. Dr. Lipsedge examined what was visible through the window and concluded it was not what it appeared to be. The window closed. The 3 minutes remained on the other side. Al Fayed's position on the memory was Al Fayed's position, the position of the father who had lost his son and who had organized his account of the loss around the conspiracy, and who had incorporated the memory loss into the conspiracy in the form of the faked memory loss of the person who was part of the conspiracy. Al Fayed said Rees-Jones was lying about the memory loss. He said the memory existed and was being suppressed. He said the suppression was the suppression of the person who was participating in the cover-up of the murder of Diana and Dodi. The letter that Al Fayed wrote to Lord Stevens, who led the British Operation Paget investigation, was a letter whose content was read at the 2008 inquest by the lawyer Ian Burnett. The letter said Al Fayed was lying about the memory loss. The letter said the memory loss was the fabrication of the person who was covering up the truth. Rees-Jones responded to the accusation at the inquest. He said, "I am not part of any conspiracy to suppress the truth at all. All I have ever done is give the truth as I see it, the truth as he sees it." The specific qualification, as I see it, was the qualification of the honest person who is providing the honest account of the honest limitation of the account. The truth as he sees it is the truth that the seeing produces, and the seeing is the seeing that the retrograde amnesia has left available, which is the seeing that ends at the departure from the back of the Ritz. The truth that ends at the departure from the back of the Ritz is the truth of the most important witness to the most watched death of the 20th century. It is the truth that includes the departure and excludes the 12 minutes and the 13th pillar. It is the most honest available truth of the person whose truth it is, and it is the truth that has a 3-minute hole in the middle of it, that the slight chance of the memory recovery and the false memories of the flashbacks and the small windows that don't last very long have not filled in the 27 years since the crash. The hole is still there. The windows remain small. They don't last very long. The truth ends at the departure from the back of the Ritz. What the world has been doing with the hole in the truth is what the remaining parts of this account examine. The phone calls started after the crash. He did not know who was calling. The caller did not identify themselves. The caller said, "We know who you are. We know where you are. We know where you live." The calls were the calls of the anonymous. The letters were the letters of the anonymous. After the crash that had killed Diana and Dodi and Henri Paul, and had left him with the titanium face and the lost memory and the 10 days in the coma, the anonymous calls and the anonymous letters had arrived in the specific form of the threat that the anonymous caller delivers to the person whose specific position in the specific event the anonymous caller has identified as the position worth threatening. He did not take the calls seriously. He said this at the 2008 inquest when the lawyers asked him about the calls and the letters. He said he was big enough and ugly enough to look after himself. The big enough and ugly enough was the former paratrooper's assessment of the threat from the anonymous caller, the assessment of the person whose formation in the 1st Battalion of the Parachute Regiment had produced the specific calibration of the threat that the formation produces in the people it produces. The anonymous calls were the calls of little people. Little people were not worth worrying about. But there was another statement. At the inquest, a lawyer asked him about a reported encounter with a woman in which he had said, "If I remember, they're going to kill me." He was asked about this statement. He responded. The court recorded the exchange. The statement has been preserved in the accounts of the inquest in the form of the reported statement that the lawyer had asked him to account for, the statement attributed to him in which the memory and the killing had been connected in the specific way that the conspiracy theory required the memory and the killing to be connected. The conspiracy theory required the memory to be the suppressed memory rather than the absent memory. The conspiracy theory required the memory to exist in the form of the present but suppressed rather than the absent because destroyed. The present but suppressed required the suppression to have a mechanism, and the mechanism of the suppression required the motivation of the suppressor, and the motivation of the suppressor required the stakes to be the stakes that the motivation requires, when the motivation is the suppression of the truth about the death of the most famous woman in the world. The stakes were, if I remember, they're going to kill me. He did not amplify the statement at the inquest. He addressed it, and he moved on. He maintained throughout the inquest the position he had maintained since the crash, the position of the person who does not support the conspiracy theories, and who has not supported the conspiracy theories, and who is providing the truth as he sees it, and whose truth as he sees it has the 3-minute hole in the middle of it that the retrograde amnesia has produced. The Al Fayed pressure was the pressure of a different order from the anonymous calls. Mohamed Al Fayed was not the anonymous caller. Mohamed Al Fayed was the bereaved father of the man who had been in the back seat. He was also the employer of the man who had been in the front seat. He was the principal of the commercial security organization, whose commercial security had been the security available to Diana and Dodi on the night of the crash. He was the person who had recalled Henri Paul to the hotel at 10:08 p.m. He was the person whose decisions about the security arrangements had produced the arrangements rather than the arrangements that the security professionals would have recommended. He was also a man who had lost his son. The two things coexisted in Mohamed Al Fayed throughout the period following the crash. The bereaved father and the person whose decisions about the security had contributed to the conditions of the night. The two things are not mutually exclusive. A person can be a bereaved father and a person whose decisions contributed to the conditions of a loss simultaneously. The coexistence of the two things in Al Fayed produced the specific intensity of the pressure that he applied to Rees-Jones in the meetings that the accounts of the period have preserved. Rees-Jones told the 2008 inquest that he had felt pressured in the meetings with Al Fayed. He said, "I felt the pressure to remember what had occurred, the fact that I could not frustrated myself and also obviously frustrated Mr. Al Fayed. In my meetings with him, he would suggest possibilities, and I would reply, that's a possibility. The suggesting of possibilities." Al Fayed would suggest the specific scenarios of the crash, the conspiracy scenarios, the murder scenarios, the British intelligence scenarios, the stun gun scenarios, and Rees-Jones would say, that's a possibility. Not that it had happened, that it was a possibility. He said, I would say, that is a possibility. I did not feel comfortable being in his presence at that time. He was obviously a very upset man, the very upset man. The father who had lost his son, and who was sitting across from the man who had been in the front seat, and who had survived, and who could not tell the father what had happened to his son in the tunnel. The father who was suggesting possibilities to the man who could not confirm or deny the possibilities, because the possibilities were in the 3-minute hole in the memory that the retrograde amnesia had produced. The discomfort was real. The discomfort of the person who is in the presence of the grief of the father who has lost his son and who cannot tell the father what the father needs to know is the discomfort of the impossible position, the position of the person whose knowledge is the knowledge that the father most needs, and whose knowledge is absent in the specific form of the 3-minute hole. Rees-Jones said he had not felt comfortable returning to work for Al Fayed after the crash. He had done it anyway. He had returned to the UK on the 3rd of October 1997. He had gone back to work for the Al Fayed organization as the head of security, in a role that the organization had made available for him as the available role for the person who was returning from the crash and the recovery, and who was the head of security that the organization required. The returning to work for Al Fayed after the crash is one of the biographical details that the accounts of the period have noted with the specific attention that the detail requires. He had been in the car. 3 of the 4 people in the car had died. One of them was Al Fayed's son. He had returned to work for the father of the dead son. He had done it in the specific condition of the person who is managing the recovery and the professional future and the available options in the form that the available options present themselves. He resigned on the 19th of May 1998. He had been back at work for approximately 7 months. The resignation was the resignation that the accumulating pressure had produced as the available response when the accumulating pressure had reached the level at which the resignation was the available response. The specific forms of the pressure, the intense pressure to remember, the discomfort in the presence, the suggesting of possibilities, the atmosphere of the organization whose bereaved principle was the bereaved principle, had produced the specific condition in which the resignation was the management of the available options in the form of the departure. Al Fayed reportedly said, "The job would still be available if Rees-Jones wanted to return." He did not return. He moved back to Oswestry, to his mother and his stepfather, to the borderland town of the Fitzalan School and the combined cadet force, and the Sue Jones marriage that was in the process of the divorce. He worked for a time in a friend's sportswear shop, the sportswear shop in Oswestry. The former paratrooper, the former bodyguard to the Princess of Wales, the sole survivor of the crash, working in a sportswear shop in the borderland town where he had grown up. He was 29 years old at the time of the crash. He was 30 when he returned to Oswestry. He was 31 when he published the book in 2000. In between the crash and the book, there was the sportswear shop in Oswestry, and the recovery from the titanium face, and the absence of the memory, and the pressure of the meetings with Al Fayed, and the resignation, and the anonymous calls from the people who knew where he lived. The conspiracy theories that surrounded him were the conspiracy theories of the specific event, whose conspiracy theories were the most elaborated available conspiracy theories of the late 20th century. The Princess Diana conspiracy theories had been in production since the night of the crash, and had been producing the specific variety of the conspiracy theory that the death of the iconic and the beloved always produces when the death is the sudden and the violent death, in circumstances whose specific character generates the available space for the theory. The available space was large. The crash was the crash whose causes had produced the official conclusions of the drunk driver and the excessive speed and the paparazzi pursuit, and the official conclusions were the conclusions that the conspiracy theories required to be the conclusions that were inadequate, the conclusions that the conspiracy theories were organized around supplementing or replacing with the alternative conclusions that the theories had organized their evidence around producing. The alternative conclusions required specific things. They required the stun gun. They required the white Fiat. They required the British intelligence operative. They required the pregnancy. They required the engagement. They required the murder order. And they required, most directly of all the things they required, the memory. The memory was the thing that the conspiracy theories required from Rees-Jones, because the memory was the only available source of the direct evidence of what had happened in the 3 minutes between the departure from the Ritz and the 13th pillar. If the memory existed and was being suppressed, the suppression was the evidence that there was something to suppress. If the memory existed and produced the account of the stun gun or the white Fiat or the intelligence operative, the account would be the direct eyewitness testimony from the person who had been in the front seat. The memory did not exist. The memory had been destroyed by the brain injury that the 13th pillar had produced at 96 miles per hour. The conspiracy theories required the memory. The memory was not available. The conspiracy theories had addressed the unavailability of the memory by concluding that the unavailability was the suppression rather than the destruction. The suppression required the suppressor. The suppressor was Rees-Jones. The motivation of the suppressor was, if I remember, they're going to kill me. He maintained throughout, at the inquest, in the book, in the interviews, that the memory was not suppressed, that the memory was not there, that the retrograde amnesia was the retrograde amnesia of the traumatic brain injury, and that the retrograde amnesia had removed the memory in the form of the removal rather than the form of the suppression. I am not part of any conspiracy to suppress the truth at all. All I have ever done is give the truth as I see it. The truth as he sees it has the 3-minute hole. The conspiracy theories have filled the hole with the suppressed memory. The medical evidence has addressed the hole as the absent memory. The psychiatrist has assessed the flashbacks as the false memories. The slight chance of recovery remains the slight chance. The calls had told him they knew where he lived. He was big enough and ugly enough. He had not taken the calls seriously. He still cannot remember. He decided to write the book because of Mohamed Al Fayed and because of the stories. The Mohamed Al Fayed reason was the reason of the man who has been publicly accused of the thing he did not do, and who has identified in the published account the available mechanism for the public refutation of the public accusation. Al Fayed had accused Rees-Jones of unprofessionalism. Al Fayed had said that his lack of professionalism, Al Fayed's words, not Rees-Jones's, had contributed to or caused the accident that killed his son and the princess. The accusation was the public accusation of the person whose commercial organization's decisions had produced the security arrangements and who was now attributing the failure of the security arrangements to the professional inadequacy of the security personnel rather than to the decisions that had organized the arrangements. Rees-Jones was not going to accept the accusation without the account. The account was the book. The story's reason was the reason of the person whose specific position in the specific event had produced the specific variety of the stories that the specific position in the specific event always generates in the period following the event. The bizarre stories, the conspiracy stories, the inaccurate stories, the stories that the available space for the story produces when the available space is the 3-minute hole in the only surviving witness's memory, and the available space has been filled by the imagination and the theory and the speculation of the people whose relationship to the event is the relationship of the outside rather than the inside. The inside was Rees-Jones. The outside was producing the stories. The stories were wrong. He wrote the book to counter the wrong stories with the available right account. The book was called The Bodyguard's Story, Diana, the Crash, and the Sole Survivor. It was published in 2000. The writing was done with the help of a ghostwriter named Moira Johnston. The ghostwriter was the specific available mechanism for the production of the published account, when the person who has the account to give is the person whose relationship to the writing of the account is not the professional writer's relationship to the account, but the former soldier and former bodyguard's relationship to the account. The person who has the material, but not the specific skill of the structuring and the producing of the material in the form of the publishable book. Johnston assembled the book from Rees-Jones's partial memories and from the accounts of the people who were not inside the car, his family, his friends, the people whose proximity to his life before and after the crash produced the available material for the reconstruction of the events from the available positions. The book was the reconstruction of the events from the partial memory and the external accounts. The specific form of the book that the partial memory produces, when the partial memory is the partial memory of the most important witness to the most significant event the book is organized around examining. The book is not written in the first person. This is the specific formal decision of the book that Rees-Jones addressed in the interview he gave for the Irish Times around the time of the publication. The first person was not available to him in the form that the book's first person requires, because the first person of the book, that is the first person account of the event, requires the first person account of the event, and the first person account of the event was not available in the form that the first person requires, when the first person is the retrograde amnesia's whole in the 3 minutes that the first person account of the event would be required to fill. He knew little or nothing about many of the events surrounding the accident. The book is not in the first person because the first person of the book's central events was the first person who was not there in the form of the memory, the person who was in the tunnel and who is not in the memory of the tunnel. The third person is the available form when the first person's account of the central events is the account that the retrograde amnesia has made unavailable. Al Fayed tried to stop the publication. The attempt to stop the publication was Al Fayed's exercise of the available legal mechanisms for the prevention of the publication of the account that Al Fayed had concluded was not the account he wanted published. The specific mechanisms of the attempt have been described in the available accounts of the publication's history as the legal interventions that the person who wants to prevent a publication deploys in the English legal system when the English legal system is the system available for the prevention. The attempt failed. The book was published. Al Fayed's characterization of the book was the characterization of the person who had tried to prevent it and had failed. He described it as a tissue of lies. The tissue of lies was Al Fayed's characterization of the account that Rees-Jones had produced of the events that Al Fayed maintained had been the murder of his son and the cover-up of the murder by the British intelligence services, whose conspiracy Rees-Jones had been part of. The tissue of lies characterization was consistent with Al Fayed's broader account of the crash and of Rees-Jones's role in the crash and the crash's aftermath. The account in which the faked amnesia and the suppressed memory and the conspiracy and the tissue of lies were the available characterizations of the person who was in the front seat and who was not supporting the conspiracy theory. The book addressed the seatbelt question directly. The seatbelt question was the question that the early reports of the crash had organized around the specific claim that Rees-Jones had survived because he was wearing a seatbelt. The claim had produced the specific consequence that the claims about professional conduct produce, when the claim about the professional conduct is the claim that the person had done the thing that the professional conduct required. The wearing of the seatbelt as the evidence of the professionalism of the person who had been accused of the unprofessionalism. The problem was that he had not been wearing a seatbelt. None of the 4 people in the car had been wearing seatbelts. The 2006 Operation Paget investigation would confirm this definitively, but at the time of the book's publication in 2000, the seatbelt question was the question whose answer Rees-Jones addressed in the specific form available to him. He said in the CBS interview that accompanied the book's publication, "It was headlines that I was wearing a seatbelt," and again brought into question various so-called security experts and newspapers, saying that it's an unprofessional thing to do. Then the report came out that I wasn't wearing a seatbelt. That proves to other people I haven't made anything up. If I'd have remembered the journey, I would have remembered I wasn't wearing a seatbelt. The sentence is the sentence of the person who is pointing to the specific evidence of the memory's absence in the form of the evidence of the thing he would have known if the memory had been present. If the memory of the journey existed, it would contain the knowledge of whether he was wearing a seatbelt. The knowledge of whether he was wearing a seatbelt is the knowledge that the reports had supplied in the wrong form of the wearing. If the memory existed and had produced the account of the wearing, the subsequent reports of the not wearing would have been the contradiction of his account. There was no contradiction. He had not claimed to have been wearing the seatbelt. He had not claimed anything about the journey, because the journey was not in the available memory. The engagement ring question was addressed in the book and in the interviews. He said he had seen no evidence during the summer of 1997 that Dodi was planning to propose. He had been Dodi's personal bodyguard. He had been present throughout the summer in Dodi's daily life. He was in a better position than almost anyone to assess the evidence of the planning of the proposal. He had not seen it. He described Diana in the book in the terms that had been produced by the specific relationship of the bodyguard to the person being protected, the relationship of the professional proximity rather than the personal intimacy. He said in the Irish Times interview, "She was a woman you could take down the pub, and from me, that's a pretty high compliment." The taking down the pub was the specific highest available compliment of the former paratrooper from Oswestry, who was describing the most famous woman in the world in the terms that the most honest available compliment produces when the most honest available compliment is the pub compliment. He said, "I am more than a car accident. There is more to me than just a car accident." He said this to The Guardian in 2000. The more than a car accident was the assertion of the person who had been reduced in the public record to the car accident, to the sole survivor, to the person with the titanium face, to the holder of the 3-minute memory hole, and who was asserting the existence of the person beneath the reduction. He said, "I am confident in myself of what I did. I am confident that I did as much as I could do in that situation. I've got to look in the mirror every day and be confident with the actions I took that night, and I'm happy to do that now." The looking in the mirror every day. The mirror that reflects the face that was rebuilt from the photograph using 150 titanium parts. The looking in that mirror and being confident with the actions taken that night. The night that ends in the available memory at the departure from the back of the Ritz. He is confident with the actions up to the departure. He does not remember the actions after the departure. The confidence extends to the departure. Beyond the departure is the 3-minute hole and the 13th pillar and the recovery and the book. The book earned him a rumoured £1 million. The £1 million is the figure that the accounts of the book's earnings have preserved as the rumoured figure, the estimate of the earnings that the 3 million copy international bestseller that was A Royal Duty by Paul Burrell might be compared to in the specific commercial market for the accounts of the people whose proximity to Diana's household had produced the commercial product. Burrell's book was A Royal Duty. Rees-Jones's book was The Bodyguard's Story. 2 books, 2 accounts of the same death from 2 different positions, 2 commercial products from the proximity to the same event. The £1 million rumoured earnings were largely consumed by legal fees. The legal fees were the legal fees of the person who had been involved in the legal proceedings that the crash and the subsequent investigations and the Al Fayed accusations and the publication of the book had generated as the legal proceedings that required the legal representation. The legal representation required the legal fees. The legal fees consumed the earnings. He also said proceeds from the book helped pay his legal bills. The proceeds and the legal bills and the net of the proceeds and the legal bills was the financial account of the sole survivor who had written the definitive account of what he could remember, and who had found in the writing of the account, and the proceeds of the writing, that the writing's product mostly covered the legal costs of having been the sole survivor. The book was the account had the whole was 3 minutes. The book was everything around the whole, everything before the whole and everything after the whole, and the specific quality of the person who had built the account around the whole, from the partial memory and the external accounts and the ghostwriter's assembly of the available material. The whole remained. The book was the shape of the whole. The book was what the whole looked like from the outside. The inquest into the deaths of Diana, Princess of Wales, and Dodi Fayed opened at the Royal Courts of Justice in London in October 2007. It had taken 10 years to get there. 10 years between the crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel and the formal legal examination of the crash in the English court that the English legal system's requirement of an inquest into the death of any person of British nationality who dies abroad had been producing as the requirement since Diana's death in August 1997. The 10 years were the 10 years of the French investigation, the British Operation Paget investigation, the Mohamed Al Fayed lawsuit, the conspiracy theories, the Paul Burrell trial, the Diana Memorial Fund, the books, the documentaries, the retrospectives, and the specific management of the Diana legacy by the institution and the people and the organizations that the legacy required to be managed. The 10 years had produced a great deal of material about the crash and its causes and its context. The 10 years had not produced the formal legal examination of the crash in the English court. The inquest produced it. The inquest jury was the jury of the 12 ordinary citizens of England and Wales, whose function in the inquest process was the function of the 12 people who examine the evidence of the death and return the verdict about the manner of the death that the evidence produces as the appropriate verdict. The inquest's jury was the specific legal instrument through which the formal legal examination was organized, the 12 people who would sit for the months of the evidence and the witnesses and the legal argument, and who would eventually return the verdict. Trevor Rees-Jones gave evidence at the inquest in January 2008. He was now known as Trevor Rees. He had dropped the Jones suffix that the Rees-Jones name had carried. The specific act of the name reduction that the person who has been identified with a hyphenated name for the duration of the event's coverage deploys when the person who has been identified with the hyphenated name decides that the reduction of the name is the available management of the identity. He walked into the Royal Courts of Justice in January 2008. The scars were visible on his face. They would always be visible. The reconstruction with the 150 titanium parts had been the reconstruction from the photograph, the reassembly of the face that had produced the available face rather than the original face. And the available face was the face with the scars that the journalists and the legal professionals and the members of the public at the inquest could see on the face of the man who was walking into the court to give evidence about the crash he could not remember. The journalists noted the scars. The journalists who covered the inquest had not been at the crash. They were covering the inquest. They were observing the sole survivor of the crash, who could not remember the crash, walking into the court to give evidence about the crash. The scars were the evidence of the crash on the person who was giving the evidence. The physical record of the 13th pillar on the face of the person who had been in the front passenger seat when the 13th pillar had been the pillar. He sat in the witness box. The lawyers examined him. The examination was the examination of the formal legal proceeding. The specific questions of the lawyers who were representing the various parties to the inquest and who were organizing their questions around the specific dimensions of the evidence that their respective parties required to be examined. The conspiracy theories were the dimension of the evidence that the inquest was required to examine in the most sustained and the most detailed form. because the conspiracy theories were the theories that Mohamed Al Fayed had maintained in the public record across the 10 years since the crash, and that the inquest was required to address in the formal legal form. The conspiracy theories required the examination. The examination required the witnesses. Rees-Jones was the witness whose position in the car made him the most significant available witness for the examination. Al Fayed's conspiracy theory was the theory that Diana and Dodi had been murdered. The murder had been organized by Prince Philip on behalf of the British establishment, which could not permit the mother of the heir to the throne to marry a Muslim man and produce a child whose half-sibling would be in the line of succession. The murder had been executed by the British intelligence services, specifically MI6, through the mechanism of the flash from a stun gun that had been fired at the Mercedes in the tunnel to disorient Henri Paul and cause him to lose control of the car. The white Fiat Uno, the car that had been identified by various witnesses as having been in the tunnel at the time of the crash and that had never been conclusively identified, was the vehicle that the intelligence operative had used. Rees-Jones had been part of the cover-up. The inquest examined all of it: the stun gun, the white Fiat, Prince Philip, MI6, the engagement ring, the pregnancy, the cover-up. Rees-Jones addressed each dimension. He said he did not support the conspiracy theories. He said he was not part of any conspiracy. He said, "I am not part of any conspiracy to suppress the truth at all. All I have ever done is give the truth as I see it, the truth as he saw it, the truth that ended at the departure from the back of the Ritz." He told the inquest about the plan he had not been happy with. He described his recommendation: 2 vehicles from the front of the hotel, and Dodi's decision, 1 vehicle from the back, with Henri Paul driving. He said he went along with it. He said he had insisted that security would travel in the vehicle with Dodi and Diana, when he had been told initially that they would travel without security. He had won that point. He had lost the point about the route and the driver. He said about Henri Paul, "People say, you should have known," but there was nothing in Henri Paul's demeanor that he had been drinking. The demeanor had not communicated the 3 times the legal blood alcohol limit. The person whose focus of attention was the sandwich and getting back on the job had not seen the intoxication in the person whose tolerance for the intoxication had concealed the physical presentation. He did not see it. He got in the car. At the inquest, he also described the flashbacks. The groan, and then Dodi's name from the back of the car, the female voice that could only have been Princess Diana, the paparazzi motorbike next to the car. He described them. The psychiatrist's assessment was also before the inquest. Dr. Lipsedge's conclusion that the flashbacks were false memories. Slight chance of recovery. The inquest received the assessment. The inquest noted that the sole survivor's 2 recovered memories had been assessed as the false memories of the traumatically injured brain rather than the genuine recovered memories of the crash. He also testified about the pressure. He told the inquest that Al Fayed had put intense pressure on him in the meetings after the crash to remember. He described the meetings in which Al Fayed would suggest possibilities, and he would say, "That's a possibility." He said he had not felt comfortable in Al Fayed's presence at that time. He described Al Fayed as obviously a very upset man. He was asked about the anonymous phone calls and letters. He said they had told him they knew who he was and where he lived. He said he had not taken them seriously. He was big enough and ugly enough to look after himself. He was asked about the reported statement to a woman, "If I remember, they're going to kill me." He addressed it. He maintained the position he had maintained throughout. The Al Fayed lawyer, Michael Mansfield QC, examined him on the conspiracy theory's requirements. Mansfield was the specific legal professional whose function at the inquest was the examination of the evidence in the direction of the conspiracy theory's support. The examination was the examination of the person whose position in the car made him the most significant available witness for the conspiracy theory's support, and whose testimony was the testimony that the conspiracy theory most required in the form of the support that the testimony could provide. The testimony did not provide the support. Rees-Jones did not support the conspiracy. He was not going to support the conspiracy. He did not believe in the conspiracy. He had been in the front seat. He had not seen the stun gun. He had not seen the intelligence operative. He had not seen the deliberate murder of the 2 people in the back seat. He had not seen anything after the departure from the back of the Ritz. The jury deliberated. The jury returned its verdict on the 7th of April 2008. The verdict was the verdict of unlawful killing. Specifically, unlawful killing, grossly negligent driving of the following vehicles: the Mercedes and the pursuing vehicles. The jury found that Henri Paul had driven grossly negligently. The jury found that the pursuing paparazzi had contributed to the crash through their pursuit. The jury did not find conspiracy. The jury did not find murder. The jury did not find the stun gun, or the white Fiat, or Prince Philip, or MI6, or the cover-up. The verdict was the verdict of the drunk driver and the pursuing photographers. The crash was the crash of the drunk driver being chased by the photographers at 96 miles per hour through the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. The verdict was the official legal conclusion of the 10 years of the investigation and the inquest and the examination. Mohamed Al Fayed rejected the verdict. He maintained the conspiracy. He maintained it until his death in August 2023. 26 years after the crash, he died, still maintaining that his son and Diana had been murdered on the orders of Prince Philip, who had himself died in April 2021. Rees-Jones had given his evidence. He had maintained his position. He had not supported the conspiracy. He had provided the truth as he saw it. The truth as he saw it ended at the departure from the back of the Ritz. The jury had returned the verdict. The inquest was over. The formal legal examination had produced the verdict that the formal legal examination had produced. If you are enjoying this story so far, do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe. It genuinely keeps this channel going, and I read every single comment. Drop one below telling me where in the world you are watching from. The sole survivor walked out of the Royal Courts of Justice. The scars were on his face. The verdict was in the record. The 3-minute hole was still in the memory. The verdict did not fill the hole. The hole remains the hole. On the 15th of February 2003, Trevor Rees married Anne Scott in Welshpool, Wales. The ceremony was in Welshpool. Anne Scott was a teacher at Belvedere School in Shrewsbury. The marriage was the marriage of the man who had been in the front passenger seat of the Mercedes and who had come out of the crash with the titanium face and the lost memory, and the 10 days in the coma, and the 7 months back at Al Fayed's, and the resignation, and the sportswear shop in Oswestry, and the book that had been published in 2000, and the security advisor role at the United Nations that he had begun in 2000, and who was now, on the 15th of February 2003, married to a teacher from Shropshire in a ceremony in Welshpool. The first marriage had been the Sue Jones marriage, the school marriage, the Fitzalan High School marriage, the marriage of the two people from the borderland town who had known each other since school and who had married on the 12th of August 1995 and who had been in the process of divorce when the crash occurred in August 1997. The divorce had been filed in June 1997. The crash was August 1997. The divorce had been in process at the moment the crash had produced the condition of the person who was now rebuilding the life that the crash had interrupted and altered. The Anne Scott marriage was the marriage of the rebuilt life. The Welshpool ceremony was the ceremony of the person who had come back from Paris, and the coma, and the titanium reconstruction, and the Al Fayed pressure, and the resignation, and the sportswear shop, and the book, and the inquest, and who was now in the available domestic life of the rebuilt life, in the form that the rebuilt life had produced. He was 34 years old at the second marriage. He had been 29 at the crash. The 5 years between the crash and the second marriage were the 5 years of the recovery from the crash's most visible consequences: the face, the memory, the coma, the Al Fayed pressure, and the 5 years of the career's reconstruction from the available positions that the career's reconstruction required. The career's reconstruction had begun with the United Nations. In 2000, the same year that The Bodyguard's story was published, Rees-Jones had begun working as a security advisor for the United Nations. The United Nations security advisory role was the available professional deployment of the formation that the 1st Battalion Parachute Regiment and the Al Fayed organization, and the specific experience of the crash and its aftermath, had produced in the person who was now the sole survivor of the most significant security failure in the history of the private security industry. The specific professional credential that the crash had produced in Rees-Jones was the credential of the person who had been inside the most significant security failure and who had survived it. The survival was the professional credential in the specific sense that the professional credential of the security advisor is the credential of the person whose experience of the security failure and the security success provides the knowledge that the advisory role requires. The crash had provided the experience of the security failure. The experience was the credential. The United Nations was the organization whose security advisory requirements were the requirements of the international organization, whose personnel and installations are present in the specific threat environments that the international organization's operations produce as the threat environments. The security advisory role was the role of the person whose specific experience and specific knowledge was the experience and knowledge that the United Nations security advisory function required. He worked in that role. He moved through the subsequent years of the career in the available professional directions that the experience and the credential and the recovery had produced as the available directions. The Halliburton role was the next significant documented professional position. The security director role at Halliburton, the American oil field services company, whose global operations produced the specific security requirements that the security director of the global oil field services company was required to address. The AstraZeneca role was the role that the Daily Mail reported in June 2021, the global head of security for AstraZeneca, the pharmaceutical company that had become the specific subject of the global attention in the specific period of the COVID-19 pandemic's vaccine development, during which AstraZeneca had produced one of the most widely distributed COVID-19 vaccines in the available vaccine development program. The global head of security for AstraZeneca, the specific professional position of the former paratrooper from Oswestry, who had been the sole survivor of the crash that killed Diana, was the global head of security for the pharmaceutical company that had produced one of the world's most significant available vaccines in the most significant global health crisis in living memory. The trajectory from the front passenger seat of the Mercedes in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel to the global head of security for AstraZeneca is the trajectory of the person who has rebuilt the professional life from the position of the sole survivor through the available professional positions that the specific experience and the specific formation and the specific credential of the sole survivor's biography had produced as the available positions. The trajectory is also the trajectory of the person who has been managing the private life alongside the professional reconstruction, the life that the second marriage and the Shropshire location and the specific domestic world of the man who now calls himself Trevor Rees have organized as the available private life of the person who was in the front seat and who came back. He lives in Shropshire. He has given few interviews in the years following the 2008 inquest. The few interviews are the few interviews of the person who has decided that the available public engagement with the story of the crash is the available public engagement that the formal legal proceedings required, and that the book required, and that the specific occasions of the anniversary journalism require, but that the ongoing daily management of the private life does not require. He said to The Guardian in 2000, "I am more than a car accident. There is more to me than just a car accident." The more than a car accident was the assertion that has organized the subsequent years, the United Nations, and the Halliburton, and the AstraZeneca, and the Shropshire, and the Anne Scott marriage, and the private life, that is more than the car accident. The car accident remains the biographical fact by which the public record identifies him. The global head of security for AstraZeneca is the former Diana bodyguard. The former Diana bodyguard is the sole survivor. The sole survivor is the person who was in the front seat. The person who was in the front seat cannot remember what happened after he left the back of the Ritz. The identification is the identification of the person whose most significant biographical fact is the car accident, and who has spent the years since the car accident asserting that he is more than the car accident in the available forms, the career and the marriage and the private life and the Shropshire and the withdrawal from the ongoing public engagement with the story. The withdrawal is the withdrawal of the person who has provided the available account in the available forms, the book in 2000, the inquest testimony in 2008, the interviews in the period of the book's publication, and who has concluded that the provision of the available account in those forms is the available engagement, and that the beyond that engagement is not the engagement that the private life requires. The beyond that engagement would be the engagement with the ongoing Diana industry, the anniversary programs, and the documentary series, and the Netflix dramatizations, and the conspiracy theory reassessments, and the specific variety of the annual reassessment of the crash and its causes and its conspiracy theories that the anniversary produces in the media calendar every August, and that the 30th anniversary in 2027 will produce in the specific form that the 30th anniversary's media calendar produces. He is not part of that industry. He has not been a regular participant in the anniversary coverage. He has not given the interview to the anniversary program every August. He has been in Shropshire. He has been at AstraZeneca. The scars are still on his face. The scars that the journalists at the 2008 inquest noted as the visible evidence of the crash on the face of the person giving evidence about the crash he could not remember are still on the face of the man who is now in Shropshire. The titanium parts are still in the face. The photograph from which the reconstruction was organized is the photograph of the face before the crash. The face after the crash is the face with the titanium parts and the scars. The memory is still not there. The 3-minute hole is still the 3-minute hole. The slight chance of recovery that Dr. Lipsedge assessed at the 2008 inquest has not produced the recovery in the years between the 2008 inquest and the present. The windows of memory remain small. They don't last very long. The 2 flashbacks, the groan and Dodi's name from the back of the car, the paparazzi motorbike next to the car, were assessed as false memories by the psychiatrist. The false memories have not been supplemented by the genuine memories in the years since the assessment. The genuine memories have not arrived. The 3-minute hole remains the 3-minute hole. He was in the front passenger seat. He was the only one of the 4 who came back. He came back to the borderland town, and the mother, and the stepfather, and the titanium face, and the absent memory, and the sportswear shop, and the book, and the United Nations, and the Halliburton, and the AstraZeneca, and the Anne Scott marriage, and the Shropshire, and the private life that is more than the car accident. He is more than the car accident. He has been more than the car accident for 27 years. The car accident is still the biographical fact by which the public record identifies him, and by which this account has been assembling the available evidence of the person who was there and who cannot remember. The more than the car accident is the life that the preceding decade of the career and the marriage and the Shropshire have been building in the available forms. The car accident is the 3-minute hole. The 3-minute hole is still there. The life around it is the life that the man who was in the front passenger seat has built in the 27 years since the 13th pillar. The 3-minute hole in Trevor Rees-Jones's memory contains the answers to every significant question about the crash that the investigations have not been able to answer from the available evidence. This is not a rhetorical statement. It is the literal description of the specific relationship between the memory that is absent and the questions that the absence has left unanswered. The available evidence has answered several questions. The speed of the Mercedes at the point of entry to the Pont de l'Alma tunnel has been established at approximately 96 miles per hour. Henri Paul's blood alcohol content has been established at 3 times the French legal limit. The presence of Prozac and Tioprodal in Henri Paul's system has been established. The crash into the 13th concrete pillar has been established. The deaths of Dodi Fayed and Henri Paul at the scene have been established. The death of Diana at the Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital at 4 a.m. has been established. The unlawful killing verdict of the 2008 inquest jury has been established. These are the established things. They are established from the forensic evidence and the witness accounts of the people who were outside the car, the paparazzi, the first responders, the hospital staff, the investigators, and from the physical examination of the crash site and the vehicle and the bodies. What is not established from the available evidence is what was happening inside the car in the 12 minutes between the departure from the Ritz and the 13th pillar. The inside of the car in those 12 minutes is the inside that the memory of the sole surviving inside the car witness would provide if the memory were available. The memory is not available. The 3-minute hole or the 12-minute hole, depending on the account, contains the inside of the car. The first question the hole contains is the Henri Paul question. The Henri Paul question is the question of what Henri Paul's behavior in the car in the 12 minutes before the crash was. The official conclusion about Henri Paul is the conclusion of the drunk driver who was driving at 96 miles per hour and who lost control in the tunnel. The drunk driver who was driving at 96 miles per hour and who lost control in the tunnel is the conclusion that the blood alcohol and the speed and the trajectory have produced as the available conclusion. But the Henri Paul question has a specific dimension that the outside evidence cannot address, which is the dimension of the inside behavior. What Henri Paul was doing in the car in the 12 minutes, what he said, how he was driving, whether there was a moment before the tunnel when his impairment was visible in the car, whether there was a moment when Rees-Jones could have intervened, or did intervene, or considered intervening and did not. The memory would address this. The memory would contain Henri Paul in the car in the 12 minutes. The memory would tell whether the driving was the driving of the person who appeared in control until the tunnel, or the driving of the person whose impairment was visible in the car before the tunnel. The memory is not there. The Henri Paul question has the outside answer of the blood alcohol and the speed. It does not have the inside answer of the behavior in the car. The second question the whole contains is the white Fiat Uno question. The white Fiat Uno is the vehicle that witnesses identified as having been present in the tunnel at approximately the time of the crash, and whose presence has been the subject of the most sustained, unresolved investigation of the crash's circumstances. The white Fiat Uno was a small white car of the Fiat Uno model that several witnesses said they saw in the tunnel in the vicinity of the Mercedes at approximately the time of the crash. The Operation Paget investigation examined the white Fiat Uno in detail. The investigation identified a candidate vehicle, a white Fiat Uno, registered to a man named Levantan, whose vehicle had damage consistent with having been involved in a minor collision. The investigation examined the vehicle and the owner and the circumstances and concluded that the evidence was insufficient to establish that the white Fiat Uno of Levantan had been in the tunnel at the time of the crash in the way that the witnesses' accounts had described. The white Fiat Uno question is the question that the memory would address most directly, because the memory of the person in the front passenger seat of the Mercedes would contain the visual field of the front passenger seat in the 12 minutes before the crash, and the visual field of the front passenger seat in the 12 minutes before the crash would contain the white Fiat Uno if the white Fiat Uno was in the visual field of the front passenger seat. If the memory contained the white Fiat Uno in the form that the conspiracy theories require, the intelligence operative's vehicle deliberately positioned to interfere with the Mercedes, the memory would be the direct eyewitness testimony that the white Fiat Uno theory required as the evidence. If the memory contained the white Fiat Uno in the form that the traffic explanation requires, the ordinary vehicle of the ordinary driver who was in the tunnel at the ordinary time, the memory would be the direct eyewitness testimony that the traffic explanation required. If the memory contained nothing, no white Fiat Uno, the memory would be the direct eyewitness testimony that the white Fiat Uno's absence from the front passenger seat's visual field required. The memory is not there. The white Fiat Uno question is in the whole. The third question the whole contains is the Diana question, not the cause of death question that has been established as the pulmonary vein rupture, not the inquest verdict question that has been established as the unlawful killing of the grossly negligent driving. The Diana question is the question of Diana's last conscious moments, the specific texture of the final minutes of the consciousness of the most famous woman in the world, in the back seat of the black Mercedes, in the 12 minutes between the Ritz and the pillar. What did she say? What did she do? Was she aware of the speed? Was she aware of the pursuit? Was she frightened? Was she calm? Was she talking to Dodi? Was she looking out the window at the Paris streets? Was she watching the paparazzi motorcycles following? Was she doing the specific thing that the last 12 minutes of the consciousness of the person who does not know they are the last 12 minutes produces in the person? The memory would contain this. The memory of the person in the front passenger seat would contain the back seat and the two people in the back seat, and the 12 minutes of what the two people in the back seat were doing and saying and being in the 12 minutes. Rees-Jones has one flashback image of Diana, the groan, and then Dodi's name. The female voice that could only have been Princess Diana in the immediate aftermath of the impact, still conscious, calling out. The psychiatrist assessed this as a false memory. If it is not a false memory, if it is the genuine recovered fragment of the crash's immediate aftermath, it is the most intimate available record of Diana in the final conscious moments. The groan, then Dodi. Whether the groan and the name are the genuine memory or the false memory is the question that the psychiatrist's assessment and the neuroscience of the false memory and the slight chance of recovery have addressed in the form of the assessment. The assessment is not the certainty. The assessment is Dr. Lipsedge's professional conclusion based on the available evidence. The available evidence includes the severity of the brain injury and the specific mechanisms of the false memory production in the traumatically injured brain. The neuroscience of the traumatic brain injury's retrograde amnesia is the neuroscience that has been developing in the decades since the crash, in the form of the research that the brain imaging technologies and the longitudinal studies of the traumatic brain injury population have been producing. The research has established that the retrograde amnesia of the severe traumatic brain injury typically produces the loss of the most recent memories, the memories closest to the moment of the injury, and that the recovery of those memories in the years following the injury is the recovery whose probability decreases with the passage of time and with the severity of the injury. The severity of Rees-Jones's injury was the severity that the surgeon's statement established. Never seen so many fractures on a man who was still alive. The passage of time is 27 years. The probability of the recovery of the 3-minute hole in the 27th year after the injury of that severity is the probability that the slight chance of the 2008 assessment has not improved across the 19 years since the assessment. The neuroscience also establishes the mechanism of the false memory production in the traumatically injured brain. The false memory is produced by the brain's assembly of the plausible account of the experience from the available material. The knowledge of the event, the information about the event, the emotional significance of the event, the suggestions and the questions and the accounts of others that the recovering person receives about the event, and the production of the memory-like experience from the assembled material rather than from the actual experience that the memory would normally represent. The groan and the name from the back seat is the plausible memory. It is plausible because it is consistent with what the outside evidence has established about Diana's post-crash condition, the evidence that she was conscious and speaking in the immediate aftermath. It is plausible because the female voice calling the name of the person in the back seat is the plausible sound of the crash's immediate aftermath for the person who was in the car. It is plausible because Rees-Jones knew Diana, had been her bodyguard, had been present in her life, and therefore had the material from which the plausible memory could be assembled. The plausible is not the genuine. The plausible is the brain's production of the plausible. The genuine would be the actual experience of the back seat and the groan and the name in the 12 minutes. The genuine is in the whole. The whole is 27 years old. The whole is the 3 minutes between the departure from the back of the Ritz and the 13th pillar. The whole contains the Henri Paul question and the white Fiat Uno question and the Diana question and all the other questions that the inside of the car in the 12 minutes contained and that the outside evidence has not been able to address from the outside position. The whole is the most significant single piece of absent evidence in the history of the investigation into Diana's death. The most significant single piece of absent evidence is not the specific document or the specific recording or the specific forensic sample. It is the 3-minute memory of the person who was in the front seat and who is in Shropshire. He said it himself. I'm the only person who can tell people for real, and I can't remember. The can't remember is the statement of the genuine absence, not the won't remember, not the am prevented from remembering. The can't remember of the person whose brain's retrograde amnesia has produced the genuine absence rather than the suppression. The genuine absence is the whole. The whole contains the truth of the 12 minutes. The truth of the 12 minutes is the thing that the 27 years of the investigation have been organized around finding in the outside evidence, because the inside evidence is the absence. The absence remains the absence. The whole remains the whole. The truth of the 12 minutes remains in the whole. Every major conspiracy theory about the crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel required something from Trevor Rees-Jones, The requiring was specific in each case, the specific thing that the specific theory needed the specific person in the front passenger seat to provide in order for the specific theory to function as the theory it was presenting itself as. The requiring was not optional. The theories could not function without the thing they required from the person in the front seat. He did not provide any of it, not because he refused, because he could not remember. The specific relationship between the conspiracy theories and the sole survivor's unavailable memory is the relationship that the 3-minute hole produces when the theories are the theories that require the memory to either confirm the theory or confirm the suppression of the theory. Both outcomes, the memory confirming the theory and the memory being suppressed, require the memory to exist. The memory that does not exist provides neither. The Al Fayed theory was the theory that Diana and Dodi had been murdered on the orders of Prince Philip, executed by British intelligence services through the deployment of the stun gun in the tunnel. The stun gun had been fired at the Mercedes to disorient Henri Paul and cause him to lose control. The white Fiat Uno had been the intelligence operative's vehicle. Rees-Jones had been part of the cover-up of the murder. The stun gun theory required Rees-Jones to have seen the stun gun or its effects. The stun gun is the specific electronic device whose deployment in the specific scenario that the theory requires would have produced the specific observable effects in the specific person at whom it was aimed, Henri Paul, in the specific setting of the front of the car where Henri Paul was driving and where Rees-Jones was sitting in the front passenger seat. If the stun gun had been deployed in the tunnel in the way the theory required, the deployment would have been visible or experienceable from the front passenger seat in one or more of the following forms. The device itself, if it was deployed from outside the car through the window or the windshield, the effects of the device on Henri Paul in the form of the sudden loss of motor control or the involuntary physical response that the stun gun's electrical charge produces in the person it is aimed at, or the specific sound or light of the device's deployment in the tunnel at close range. Rees-Jones was in the front passenger seat. If the stun gun had been deployed in the way the theory required, the person in the front passenger seat was the person most likely to have seen or experienced the deployment or its effects. The stun gun theory therefore required the person in the front passenger seat to have the memory of the stun gun. He does not have the memory. He does not have the memory of the stun gun or its effects or Henri Paul's sudden loss of motor control. He does not have the memory of anything after the departure from the back of the Ritz. The stun gun's absence from the available memory is not the absence of the stun gun from the front passenger seat's experience. The absence is the absence of the memory of the experience. The memory does not contain the stun gun. The memory does not contain anything. The conspiracy theory's response to the absence was the response that the conspiracy theory always produces when the evidence fails to appear in the form the theory requires. The evidence's failure to appear is itself incorporated into the theory as the evidence of the suppression. The stun gun is absent from the memory. The memory is absent because the memory is being suppressed. The suppression is the cover-up. The cover-up is the proof. The circular logic is the logic of the conspiracy theory that has incorporated the absence of evidence as the evidence. The specific closed loop of the theory that explains the evidence's absence as the proof of the theory rather than as the challenge to the theory. The loop does not require the memory to confirm the theory. The loop requires only the memory's absence, and the memory's absence is the available condition. The white Fiat Uno theory required Rees-Jones to have seen the white Fiat Uno in the tunnel, not necessarily in the form of the deliberate weapon of the intelligence operative. The theory had multiple versions, including the version in which the white Fiat Uno was simply a vehicle that had been present in the tunnel and that Henri Paul had swerved to avoid, producing the loss of control that had resulted in the 13th pillar. In this version, the white Fiat Uno was not the murder weapon but the triggering vehicle, the ordinary car of the ordinary driver, whose presence had produced the extraordinary outcome. Either version required the white Fiat Uno to have been visible from the front passenger seat of the Mercedes in the tunnel. If the white Fiat Uno was in the tunnel at the time of the crash, in the way that the witnesses' accounts suggested, and if the white Fiat Uno was in the visual field of the front passenger seat at any point in the 12 minutes, the memory of the front passenger seat's visual field would contain the white Fiat Uno. The memory is not there. The white Fiat Uno is in the hole with everything else. The engagement ring theory required Rees-Jones to confirm or deny whether Dodi had been planning to propose. He had been Dodi's personal bodyguard throughout the summer. He had been present in Dodi's daily life. He had been at the Riposi visit on the afternoon of the 30th of August. He had the specific knowledge of the summer that the engagement ring theory required in the form of the confirmation or the denial. He denied it. He said he had seen no evidence during the summer that Dodi was planning to propose. The denial was the specific denial of the person whose access to the available evidence had produced the available conclusion, and whose conclusion was the conclusion of the absence of the evidence. This is the one dimension of the theories that did not require the 3-minute memory. It required the summer memory rather than the crash memory, and the summer memory was the memory that had not been destroyed by the brain injury. The summer memory was available. The summer memory produced the denial. The denial was a real contribution to the available record. Al Fayed rejected the denial. Al Fayed's rejection of the denial was the rejection of the person whose theory required the engagement and whose sole survivor had denied the engagement. The rejection was, he is lying. The lying was the cover-up. The cover-up required the suppression. The suppression was the suppressed memory. The pregnancy theory required no specific memory from Rees-Jones because the pregnancy theory was the theory about Diana's condition rather than the crash's mechanics, and Rees-Jones's access to Diana's condition was the access of the professional proximity rather than the intimate knowledge of the person whose access to Diana's medical condition was the medical access. He was the bodyguard. He was not the obstetrician. The pregnancy theory did not require his specific memory. What the pregnancy theory did require, and this is the dimension of the pregnancy theory that connects it to the sole survivor, was the context of the murder motivation. If Diana was pregnant with Dodi's child, the murder motivation was the motivation of the institution that could not permit the mother of the heir to the throne to produce the half-sibling of the heir with the Muslim man whose father owned Harrods. The murder motivation required the pregnancy. The pregnancy required the medical evidence. The medical evidence from the Paris hospital established that Diana was not pregnant at the time of the crash. The medical evidence produced the denial of the pregnancy. The denial of the pregnancy removed the specific murder motivation that the theory required. The theory required the pregnancy for the motivation. The medical evidence removed the pregnancy. The theory incorporated the medical evidence as the cover-up. The cover-up is the theory's response to every denial. The denial of the stun gun by the absent memory is the cover-up of the stun gun. The denial of the white Fiat Uno by the absent memory is the cover-up of the white Fiat Uno. The denial of the engagement by the summer memory is the cover-up of the engagement. The denial of the pregnancy by the medical evidence is the cover-up of the pregnancy. Every denial is the cover-up. Every absence is the proof. The conspiracy theory is the closed loop that no available evidence can open, because the available evidence is always incorporated into the loop as the evidence of the suppression of the evidence that the theory requires. Rees-Jones is the specific person whose position in the loop is the most paradoxical available position. He is the sole survivor whose memory is the most significant available missing piece of the evidence that the loop requires. His memory's absence is the most significant available proof of the suppression that the loop deploys as the cover-up. He is simultaneously the person who could resolve the theory if his memory were available, and the person whose unavailability of the memory is the theory's most powerful available evidence. The more precisely he describes the genuine absence of the memory, the retrograde amnesia, the false flashbacks, the slight chance of recovery, the I'm the only person who can tell people for real and I can't remember, the more precisely he provides the conspiracy theory with the material it incorporates as the suppression. The genuine absence and the suppressed memory look identical from the outside. The theory lives in the space between the two that the outside cannot penetrate. The neuroscience can assess the probability of the genuine absence. The psychiatrist can assess the flashbacks as false memories. The inquest can return the unlawful killing verdict. The Operation Paget can examine the white Fiat Uno and find insufficient evidence. None of it can prove the genuine absence to the person who has decided the absence is the suppression. The proof of the genuine absence is the memory itself. the memory that would appear and would not contain the stun gun, and would not contain the intelligence operative, and would not contain the deliberate murder, and would contain the drunk driver losing control in the tunnel at 96 miles per hour. The memory is the proof. The memory is in the whole. The whole is the conspiracy theory's most reliable available ally, not because the whole contains the things the conspiracy theory requires, because the whole cannot demonstrate that it does not contain the things the conspiracy theory requires. The whole is the absence that looks from the outside like the presence that is being suppressed. It looks that way because from the outside, the genuine absence and the suppressed presence are indistinguishable. He cannot remember. The theories require the memory. He cannot provide it. The theories incorporate the inability to provide it as the evidence of the suppression. The loop closes. It has been closed for 27 years. He described Diana as a woman you could take down the pub. He said, "From me, that's a pretty high compliment." The pub compliment is the specific compliment of the specific person, the former paratrooper from Oswestry, the middle son of the army surgeon, the man who had been in the 1st Battalion and had served in Northern Ireland, and who had been working 18-hour shifts on the cruise to protect 2 people from the paparazzi that summer. The pub compliment is not the compliment of the person who is performing the tribute to the dead princess. It is the compliment of the person who is telling you something true about the person they knew in the specific register that their formation has produced as the available register of the genuine assessment. He was not performing the tribute. He was not the person who performs the tribute. Journalists who met him in the period of the book's publication said they were surprised by 2 things: that he was not breaking down in tears every 5 minutes, and that he was not up in arms bad-mouthing his ex-employer, Mohamed Al Fayed, every 5 seconds. He said about the first, "I'm not that kind of bloke." He said about the second, "Trevor Rees-Jones is clearly a man to whom duty and loyalty are paramount." This was the Irish Times's characterization of him. The Irish Times journalist who interviewed him in 2000 had produced the observation that the man who had been accused by his employer of unprofessionalism and by the conspiracy theorists of murder cover-up was maintaining the specific quality of the person who does not bay for blood and does not perform the emotional devastation, and who is simply the person he is, in the available form. The available form was the former paratrooper. The former paratrooper does not break down in tears every 5 minutes. The former paratrooper does not bay for blood. The former paratrooper from Oswestry, who had been in Northern Ireland and who had been in the front seat of the Mercedes, maintains the specific formation that the 1st Battalion of the Parachute Regiment and the Shropshire Borderland and the Army Surgeon's household had produced across the years of the formation. The formation produced the person who said big enough and ugly enough to look after himself about the anonymous threatening calls. The formation produced the person who maintained the "I'm not part of any conspiracy" throughout the years of the conspiracy theory's pressure. The formation produced the person who said "I went along with it" about the plan he had not been happy with. The honest acknowledgement of the specific decision in the specific circumstances of the commercial bodyguard who could not override the employer's choice. The "I went along with it" is one of the most significant self-assessments in the entire account. He was not happy with the plan. He had recommended the 2 vehicles from the front. He had insisted that security travel with the couple. He had lost the specific battle about the route and the driver. He had gone along with it. He says so. He did not elide the going along with it. He did not produce the account of the night in which his professional judgment had been vindicated at every turn and the blame lay entirely elsewhere. He said he went along with it. That is the account of the person who is giving the honest account rather than the self-serving account. The self-serving account would have been the account of the professional whose every recommendation had been perfect and whose every instinct had been correct and who had been overridden at every critical point by the employer whose decisions had produced the conditions. The honest account was the account of the person who had been overridden and who had gone along with it, because the going along with it had been the available response in the specific circumstances of the commercial bodyguard's relationship to the employer's decision. The conspiracy theories have not been fair to him. This is the honest statement that the account of what the theories required from him and what they did with the absence of what they required produces as the honest assessment of the fairness question. The theories required the suppressed memory. The memory is genuinely absent. The theories have incorporated the genuine absence as the suppressed presence. The incorporating of the genuine absence as the suppressed presence is not the fair treatment of the person whose genuine absence is the genuine medical condition of the retrograde amnesia of the traumatic brain injury whose every bone in the face was broken. Mohamed Al Fayed has not been fair to him. The accusation of unprofessionalism, that his lack of professionalism contributed to or caused the accident that killed his son and the princess, is the accusation that the available evidence does not support. The available evidence of the night supports the account of the person who was unhappy with the plan and who went along with the plan because the plan was the employer's plan. The available evidence of the night does not support the account of the person whose professional inadequacy caused the crash. The crash was caused by the drunk driver driving at 3 times the speed limit in a tunnel. The drunk driver was drunk at 3 times the legal blood alcohol limit. The drunk driver had been recalled to the hotel at 10:08 p.m. by the employer whose son's decision to leave through the back in a single vehicle, driven by Henri Paul, was the decision that the employer's son had made. Rees-Jones had been unhappy with the plan. He had recommended the alternative. He had gone along with the plan because he could not override the employer's son. The accusation of unprofessionalism is the accusation of the bereaved father who has identified in the person who survived, the person whose survival requires the explanation, and whose explanation is the participation in the murder of the person who did not survive. The explanation is the cover-up. The cover-up requires the unprofessionalism as the pretextual accusation that establishes the character of the person the cover-up has identified as the cover-up's participant. Rees-Jones has not given the accusation the response that the self-serving account would have given it. He has not dismantled Al Fayed in the interviews, in the form that the dismantling would require. He said in the Irish Times interview that he was not up in arms and bad-mouthing his ex-employer every 5 seconds. He described Al Fayed at the inquest as obviously a very upset man. He said he did not feel comfortable in Al Fayed's presence during the meetings after the crash. Obviously a very upset man. The bereaved father, who is also the person whose decisions contributed to the conditions of the night, is the obviously very upset man. The description is the description of the person who has declined to produce the full accounting of the bereaved father's failures, alongside the bereaved father's grief, and who has settled for the available characterization of the grief, rather than the accounting of the failures. The obviously very upset man is the description that leaves Al Fayed the grief and declines to produce the accounting. The seatbelt question. The reports had said he had survived because he was wearing the seatbelt. He had not been wearing the seatbelt. None of them had been. He had said that if he had remembered the journey, he would have remembered he was not wearing a seatbelt. The saying of it is the specific form of the honest engagement with the seatbelt question in the available memory's terms, the specific demonstration of the memory's absence through the demonstration of the thing the memory would have contained if the memory had been present. This is the specific form of the honest account. The honest account demonstrates the memory's absence through the specific things the memory would have contained if the memory had been present. The seatbelt, the white Fiat Uno, the stun gun, the engagement ring, Henri Paul's behavior in the car, Diana's last conscious moments. All of the things the memory would have contained if the memory had been present. All of the things whose absence from the memory demonstrates the memory's absence in the specific form of the things whose presence in the memory would have been demonstrable if the memory had been present. I am more than a car accident. There is more to me than just a car accident. He said this to The Guardian in 2000. The more than the car accident is the assertion of the person who has been the car accident in the public record since August 1997, and who has been building the more than in the available forms since August 1997, the United Nations and the Halliburton and the AstraZeneca and the Anne Scott marriage and the Shropshire and the private life that the available forms have been building around the car accident. The more than the car accident is also the specific assertion of the person who understands that the public record has reduced him to the car accident, and that the reduction is the reduction that the car accident produces when the car accident is the most significant available biographical fact, and the public record organizes the person around the most significant available biographical fact. He knows the reduction. He asserts the more than. He has been building the more than for 27 years. The building has produced AstraZeneca, and Shropshire, and Anne Scott, and the private life. The crash produced the titanium face, and the absent memory, and the 10 days in the coma, and the Al Fayed pressure, and the conspiracy theory paradox, and the inquest testimony, and the seatbelt question, and the I'm not that kind of bloke, and the pub compliment, and the big enough and ugly enough, and the I went along with it, and the not part of any conspiracy, and the all I have ever done is give the truth as I see it. The truth as he sees it ends at the departure from the back of the Ritz. The truth as he sees it has been the honest truth of the person who is giving the honest account of the honest limitation of the account. The truth ends at the departure. The departure is what he has been saying since the first interview after the crash. The departure is the last true memory. Everything after the departure is the whole. The honest account of the person in the whole is the account that ends at the departure. He has been giving that account for 27 years. The account has not changed. The departure is still the departure. The whole is still the whole. He is the man in the front seat. He is also the man in Shropshire. He is the man who was in the front seat and who is now in Shropshire, and who has built the more than the car accident in the 27 years between the front seat and Shropshire. The front seat is the public record. Shropshire is the more than. Kes Wingfield was in the decoy car. The decoy car was the Range Rover that had left the front of the Ritz Hotel at approximately the same time as the black Mercedes had left the back. The decoy plan had been Henri Paul's plan. The two vehicles, the front and the back, the photographers following the decoy while the couple escaped in the other car. Wingfield was the second bodyguard, the other half of the two-person security provision that the Al Fayed organization had assigned to protect Dodi and Diana in Paris that summer. He was in the Range Rover. Rees-Jones was in the Mercedes. The Range Rover went out the front. The photographers followed. Some of them followed the Range Rover. Some of them had identified the back exit as the real departure point and had been waiting. The decoy worked partially and failed partially, which is the specific outcome of the decoy plan whose execution produces the partial rather than the complete success. The partial because the photographers were not all deceived, and the partial because the ones who were not deceived were the ones who had already positioned themselves at the back exit. Wingfield was in the decoy. He was not in the tunnel. The specific quality of Wingfield's experience of the night is the quality of the person who was the other half of the security provision and who was not in the car that entered the tunnel. He was in the car that was not the Mercedes. He was in the car that did not go to the tunnel. He was in the decoy, performing the decoy's function, managing the photographers who had followed the decoy, and then, at some point in the 12 minutes between the departure from the Ritz and the crash, receiving the information that the information available to the person in the decoy car would have produced at the point when the information was available. Wingfield gave evidence at the 2008 inquest. His testimony was the testimony of the person who had been the second bodyguard and who had been in the decoy car and who had the specific account of the night from the position of the person who was outside the tunnel. The outside position was the position of the person who had been working the 18-hour shifts on the cruise alongside Rees-Jones and who had been managing the same paparazzi siege and who had been present in the same professional environment and who had then been placed by the decoy plan in the car that was not the Mercedes. He said at the inquest the sentence that has been the most direct available professional assessment of the security failure of the night. If we were allowed to have done our jobs properly by the organization, we wouldn't be having this conversation now. The organization. Not Henri Paul, not the paparazzi. The organization. The Al Fayed organization whose decisions about the security arrangements had produced the arrangements that had been the arrangements of the night. The decisions had been the decisions of the employer rather than the decisions of the security professionals, and the security professionals' assessment of the employer's decisions was the assessment that Wingfield had produced in the testimony that the inquest had received. Wingfield had also been working 18-hour shifts. He and Rees-Jones had been the two people managing the protection of the couple across the summer with the specific resource allocation of the two people. The two people for the couple whose protection the specific threat environment of the Dodi and Diana public relationship required had been the resource allocation that the organization had made available. The two people had been working 18-hour shifts. The 18-hour shifts had produced the specific condition of the person who is managing the protection task in the state of the sustained operational fatigue. His sandwich comment, "I wasn't thinking about Henri Paul's drinking. My focus of attention was getting a sandwich down my neck as soon as possible and getting back on the job," was the comment of the person who is describing the specific condition of the sustained operational fatigue in the honest form that the sustained operational fatigue requires. The sandwich was the sandwich of the 18-hour shift. The not thinking about Henri Paul's drinking was the not thinking of the person whose focus of attention had been organized around the sandwich and the job, rather than the driver's blood alcohol content. He was in the decoy. He was eating, or trying to eat, the sandwich. The Mercedes was in the tunnel. The paparazzi who were at the scene of the crash immediately after the impact were the 9 photographers and the 1 motorcycle driver who were detained by the French authorities in the days following the crash on suspicion of manslaughter and failing to render assistance. The detaining was the French legal system's response to the specific question of the photographers' presence at the scene and their actions in the time between their arrival and the arrival of the emergency services. The photographers' accounts of what they saw and did in the tunnel in the immediate aftermath of the crash were the accounts that the French investigation examined in the specific form of the legal proceedings that the examination required. The accounts varied. The accounts described different things in different sequences. Some described rendering assistance, some described photographing, some described both in different orders. The accounts were the accounts of people who were at the scene of the crash and who were simultaneously the people whose pursuit of the car had been identified as the contribution to the conditions that produced the crash. The specific biographical detail of the paparazzi who were at the crash is the detail that the coverage of the crash has addressed primarily in the institutional and the ethical dimensions. The question of the paparazzi culture and the paparazzi pursuit and the specific relationship between the commercial incentive of the photographs and the safety of the people being photographed. The individual accounts of the individual photographers in the tunnel, in the immediate aftermath, have been less examined than the institutional dimension. What the photographers saw in the tunnel was what the photographers' accounts have described in the form that the accounts produced. Diana was conscious. She was alive. She was in the back seat of the damaged Mercedes. The photographers were present. Some of them photographed. The photographs that were taken in the tunnel in the immediate aftermath of the crash were the photographs that the subsequent legal proceedings and the subsequent editorial decisions of the news organizations that received them and the subsequent decisions of the courts and the relevant regulatory authorities had managed in the direction of the not published. The photographs of the injured and the dying Diana in the tunnel of the Pont de l'Alma were the photographs that the available evidence establishes were taken and that the available evidence establishes were not published in the British press and were suppressed in the French legal proceedings, and whose existence in the available record is the existence of the established but not published. The first responders were the people who arrived at the tunnel after the photographers and before the hospital. The SAMU, the Service d'Aide Médicale Urgente, was the French emergency medical service whose specific protocols for the trauma patient had organized the response to the crash around the stay-and-play approach rather than the scoop-and-run approach. The physician who attended Diana at the scene was Dr. Frédéric Méliès. He was a SAMU physician who happened to be driving through the tunnel shortly after the crash and who stopped to provide the initial medical assistance before the formal SAMU response arrived. Dr. Méliès's account of what he found in the tunnel has been preserved in the available record as the account of the physician who was the first medical professional at the scene. He found Diana conscious and making sounds. He assessed her injuries. He called the SAMU. He provided the initial assistance. He did not know who she was. He was providing the initial medical assistance to the injured person in the back seat of the crashed Mercedes before the formal emergency response arrived. When the formal SAMU response arrived, the physician-led team took over the management of Diana's treatment at the scene. The treatment at the scene was the treatment that produced the 40 minutes in the tunnel before the transport to the Pitié-Salpêtrière. The 40 minutes was the stay and play, the stabilization of the patient at the scene before the careful transport to the hospital. The question of whether the stay and play protocol was the right protocol for Diana's specific injuries, the pulmonary vein rupture that would be identified at the hospital as the fatal injury, is the question that the medical assessment has addressed in the form of the debate between the medical professionals about the relative merits of the stay and play and the scoop and run in the specific case of the traumatic cardiac injury. The debate has not produced the consensus that would allow the available record to state definitively that the scoop and run would have produced the different outcome. The pulmonary vein rupture is the injury whose severity the surgical team at the hospital found unsurvivable. The first responders saw Diana alive. Dr. Méliès saw her alive and conscious. The SAMU team saw her and treated her for 40 minutes. The ambulance transported her. The hospital received her at 2:06 a.m. The surgeons operated for 2 hours. She died at 4 a.m. All of these people, Wingfield in the decoy, the photographers at the scene, Dr. Méliès, the SAMU team, the ambulance crew, the hospital surgeons, were outside the car. They were outside the 3-minute hole. They saw the aftermath. They saw the before. They did not see the inside. The inside was Rees-Jones. The inside is the hole. The inside is the 12 minutes between the departure from the Ritz and the 13th pillar that the outside people, Wingfield in the decoy, the photographers at the scene, Dr. Méliès stopping in the tunnel, did not see and cannot account for from the inside. The outside accounts have produced the verdict. The unlawful killing of the grossly negligent driving. The outside accounts have produced the established facts. The speed, the blood alcohol, the pillar, the deaths. The inside account is the absent account. The inside account is the 3-minute hole. The inside account is what Rees-Jones cannot give, because the retrograde amnesia has placed the inside account in the hole. Wingfield was in the Range Rover. He was not in the hole. The photographers were in the tunnel. They were not in the hole. Dr. Méliès stopped his car. He was not in the hole. The hole is the inside of the Mercedes in the 12 minutes. The hole has one witness. The witness cannot remember. The verdict was returned without the inside account. The verdict was returned without the inside account produced. The inside account remains unavailable. The hole remains the hole. Trevor Rees-Jones was in the front seat. He is the only living person who was inside the Mercedes between 12:20 a.m. and 12:23 a.m. on the 31st of August, 1997. He cannot tell you what happened in those 3 minutes. Not because he will not, because the brain injury that every bone in his face was broken produced has removed the 3 minutes from the available memory in the specific form of the retrograde amnesia that the traumatic brain injury of that severity produces. He said it himself, "I'm the only person who can tell people for real, and I can't remember." The sentence is the sentence of 27 years. He said it in 2000 when the book was published. He said it at the 2008 inquest when the lawyers examined him. He has been saying it in the available forms since the first interview after the crash. The sentence has not changed. The memory has not returned. The 3-minute hole is still the 3-minute hole. The honest verdict of this account requires 3 honest statements about the 3-minute hole and what it means. The first honest statement is about what the hole contains. The hole contains the 12 minutes between the Ritz and the 13th pillar. The 12 minutes contain the inside of the car, Henri Paul at the wheel, Dodi in the back left, Diana in the back right, Rees-Jones in the front passenger seat. The 12 minutes contain the Paris streets and the pursuing paparazzi, and the speed building, and the tunnel approaching, and the 13 seconds inside the tunnel before the 13th pillar. The 12 minutes also contain the last conscious minutes of Diana, Princess of Wales. She was alive in those 12 minutes. She was in the back seat. She was in the car. Whatever she said, and whatever she saw, and whatever she was thinking, in the 12 minutes between the Ritz and the pillar, is in the 12 minutes. The 12 minutes are in the hole. The hole is in the memory of the person in Shropshire. Nobody will ever know what those 12 minutes contained. Not because of a conspiracy, not because of a cover-up, because the brain of the person who was there was damaged by the 13th pillar at 96 miles per hour, and the damage removed the 12 minutes in the specific form of the retrograde amnesia that the damage produces, and the psychiatrist assessed as the genuine absence rather than the suppressed presence, and the neuroscience addresses as the memory, whose slight chance of recovery has not been realized in the 27 years since the assessment. The 12 minutes are gone. They are not retrievable. They are not in a file somewhere. They are not in a suppressed document. They are in the damaged brain of the former paratrooper from Oswestry, who now works in security in Shropshire, and whose face was rebuilt from a photograph using 150 titanium parts. The second honest statement is about what the whole has produced. The whole has produced the conspiracy theories, not because the whole contains the things the conspiracy theories require, because the whole cannot demonstrate that it does not contain the things the conspiracy theories require. The genuine absence and the suppressed presence are indistinguishable from the outside. The whole is the conspiracy theory's most reliable available ally, not because the whole contains the murder, but because the whole cannot prove it does not. 27 years of the conspiracy theories. 27 years of the Al Fayed allegation, and the stun gun, and the white Fiat Uno, and the MI6, and the Prince Philip, and the suppressed memory. 27 years of the investigation, French, British, inquest, returning the available conclusions of the drunk driver and the excessive speed and the paparazzi pursuit. 27 years of the unlawful killing verdict and the not conspiracy finding, and the Mohamed Al Fayed maintaining the murder allegation until his own death in August 2023. The whole absorbed all of it. The whole did not answer. The whole cannot answer. The whole is the whole. The third honest statement is about the man. Trevor Rees-Jones went along with a plan he was not happy with. He said so. He was unhappy with the one vehicle from the back plan. He recommended the two vehicle from the front plan. He could not override the employer's decision. He went along with it. He got in the front seat. He has maintained the honest account of the honest limitation of the account across 27 years. He has not embellished. He has not dramatized. He has not performed the grief or the guilt or the survivor's burden in the form that the performance of those things takes when the performance is organized around the available commercial forms of the performance. He gave the interview for the book. He gave the inquest testimony. He said, "I went along with it." He said, "I am not part of any conspiracy." He said, "I am more than a car accident." He has not claimed to remember what he does not remember. This is the specific character of the honest account, the account that does not fill the hole with the available material and present the filling as the memory. The two flashbacks arrived. The psychiatrist assessed them as false memories. He reported both to the inquest, including the psychiatrist's assessment that they were false. He did not deploy the flashbacks as the genuine recovered memory of the conspiracy theory's requirement. He reported them and the assessment together. The conspiracy theories deployed the flashbacks as the evidence of the recovered memory. He did not. He reported them and the assessment. That is the character. The "I went along with it," and the "I am not part of any conspiracy," and the "I am more than a car accident," and the pub compliment for Diana, and the "big enough," and "ugly enough," and the "not that kind of bloke." The former paratrooper from Oswestry, who has been maintaining the honest account of the honest limitation across 27 years. The honest limitation is the departure from the back of the Ritz, the last true memory. Everything after the departure is the whole. He has been saying this for 27 years. The whole has not changed. The memory has not returned. The slight chance of recovery has not been realized. He is in Shropshire. The face was rebuilt from a photograph. The titanium is still in the face. The scars are still on the face. The 3 minutes are still in the hole. Diana called out Dodi's name from the back seat. Or she did not. The psychiatrist says she did not. That the flashback is false. That the brain assembled the plausible from the available material rather than recovering the genuine. Either the groan and the name are the last recorded sound of the most famous woman in the world in the last conscious moments of her life, or they are the traumatically injured brain's production of what the most famous woman in the world's last conscious moments might have sounded like. He cannot tell you which. He is the only person who can tell you for real. He cannot tell you. That is the honest verdict. Not the conspiracy, and not the cover-up, and not the suppressed memory, and not the British intelligence, and not the stun gun, and not the white Fiat Uno. The honest verdict is the genuine absence of the 3 minutes from the memory of the person whose face was rebuilt from a photograph and who is in Shropshire and who has been saying for 27 years that the departure from the back of the Ritz is the last true memory and that everything after the departure is gone. The departure was at 12:20 a.m. on the 31st of August, 1997. The 13th pillar was at 12:23 a.m. 3 minutes. The 3 minutes are the hole. The hole is 27 years old. The hole will not be filled. The man who could fill it is in Shropshire. He cannot fill it. The most important witness to the most watched death of the 20th century cannot remember what happened. He has told you this himself for 27 years, in the only available form of the truth as he sees it. The truth as he sees it ends at the departure from the back of the Ritz. Everything after is the whole. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen right now. I think you will really enjoy them. And please do not forget to subscribe if you haven't already. It means more than you know. See you in the next one.